I think the biggest takeaway is that Just Cause 4 is the game that the Just Cause that everybody wanted, the Just Cause that everybody really deserved from the beginning, and they're gonna get it.
Solís suffers frequent extreme weather events.
Extreme weather will switch up your Just Cause experience like never before. Get ready for one hell of a ride. Whilst the parachute is open, you can grapple to the soil to anchor yourself. From there, you can shoot at enemies below. If you whip into your wingsuit, they will have a much harder time tracking your movements. Being able to switch between a primary and a secondary loadout is a similar aspect to Just Cause 3.
We kind of removed some of the, maybe the more cartoony notes and tried to bring a humanity to the characters that we haven't previously seen, and tell a little bit more complex story than they ever have tried before. I kind of began from a place of, you know, everyone has ever loved him has died.
Yeah.
Or betrayed him.
Right.
So he's kind of inheriting that baggage as he's coming into it.
I think it's an enemy that stands out or is different than anything we've seen, both in Just Cause, but really any other game. We're very excited kind of to have her as a foil to Rico.
So a new bit to the story is Rico now does birthday parties. And you can basically just reveal a big surprise. If you have a fence, he'll lift out for you and go, surprise!
Players will tackle each and every objective in any order they choose. Your own actions and itinerary will decide what you experience on Solís.
Everywhere you go, everything you do, you're experiencing some part of the story, and it's really in your own order.
As an Indiana Jones fan, like a die-hard one, I cannot wait to explore the rainforest. I want to find the temples.
It's there. It's there. You're going to find all kinds of things, and even unexpected things.
Okay.
The temple stuff is the easy stuff. It's the stuff that you didn't see coming.
Oh, wow.
That's going to really change. Wow. In the rainforest, you're probably more likely to run into ghosts.
Right.
Hiding in the trees, using their camo tech to get around you, get through you.
Every biome is packed with people to meet.
Just Cause 4 is designed to be explored.
Powered by its new Apex engine, Just Cause 4 has never looked or played better.
How many total balloons can I attach to the top of it before I can get it to like lift? Is there a total amount I can put on there?
Is there like a limit?
The limit has been upped a lot from Just Cause 3. At least that's twice as much as Just Cause 3. That's something that I can say quite comfortably.
Okay, cool.
We've taken everything players love about Just Cause and improved on it.
Yeah, about that. What do people love about these games? In fact, what makes a game Just Cause? The ultimate escapism? Over-the-top action scenes? Perhaps the sandbox? The original game, which I'll call Just Cause 1 to avoid confusion, was a parody on old action films. It had a huge open map and didn't take itself very seriously, but many of the elements that make up the gameplay of the new games were not there yet. Nowadays it feels quite barren and experimental. 4 years later, Just Cause 2 arrived, a much more fleshed out game with a diverse world filled with far more unique missions and characters. It's here that the integrated grappling hook made its entrance. It used to be a gun that attached only to vehicles. Now, combined with the parachutes that Rico can put out of his ass, they've created a movement system that launched the franchise into fame. Even now, Just Cause 2 is still a beloved game by many. 5 years later, Just Cause 3 arrived. It had a bit of a rebranding. While staying true to the spirit of the older games, there was a much larger focus on the sandbox elements. Players would spawn a near infinite amount of vehicles whenever and wherever they wanted, and traversing the huge Mediterranean map was easier than ever due to the new wingsuit and the refined animations. It was very well received, although not without criticism. Despite the long development time, the game had rocky launch, with numerous bugs and, more importantly, bad performance, especially on consoles. Still, the game seemed like an excellent foundation to build on, especially when given a bit more time to flesh out the technical problems. So color me surprised that during E3 2018, the successor got announced, to be released in December that year.
I was born to fight wars that no army could win. There was no fear, no failure. But the rules have changed. The enemy changed. And no one was ready for it.
This game was created in only 3 years by the same development team who made Just Cause 3, Avalanche Studios, New York. Only 2 years if you take the DLC into account. As a fan of the franchise, I was both excited and worried for Just Cause 4, but mostly I was curious where the most important improvements would be made. Well, as a start, they could try to learn from their recent mistakes, make sure it runs better, make the missions and liberation more diverse, and add some map variety. Obviously, those are the bare minimum. For a new entry, you need to add a whole bunch of new functions to justify the creation of that game. Lucky for me, my fears seem to be unjustified. The promos that I showed at the start, alongside gameplay from big content creators, looked great. We've got 4 unique biomes on the map, each with a distinct feeling. There's extreme weather types including tornadoes. We get an antagonist that's Rico's equal. The grappling hook would be greatly expanded on, and the missions and liberation gained some much needed variety. But then the game launched, and despite being hyped, I was left with mixed feelings, even after only a limited time with the game. At first, the empty promises were not quite that prominent. Instead, we got distracted by despicable launch state. The game was unstable to some, full of bugs. There were broken controls. Many players were disappointed with the visuals, which did not represent those from the promotional material, or for that matter, any 2018 open world game. It was most noticeable in cutscenes and in the rivers. Most of these problems could be fixed in a patch, and to an extent they have, but as time went on, people started to point out other issues as well. Players missed the liberation system from the last entry. People found the hacking missions to be boring, and the characters unappealing, including Rico Rodriguez himself. The game got repetitive quickly due to the lack of mission variety and the overload of little boring activities. What's interesting to me is how these issues are part of choices that must have been made near the start of the development, which I believe is the reason why even after all these patches, so many of the elements in this game don't work. It's easy enough to point out surface level issues and scream that the developers have to fix it. But even if you make the game look beautiful and run stable, it still won't be a good game. Today I want to look into why this is, and what could have been done to make the game better in the first place. Of course, it won't be fixed anymore, but I'd still like to achieve 2 things. On one hand, I want to show fans what they could have had, hoping they will demand more quality for their money the next time around. On the other hand, I want to give the developers some inspiration of what a Just Cause game could be. I will break down the gameplay and story in detail and try to stay as objective in this assessment as possible to show everything the game did wrong, or in some cases right. It's important to see how all these little details come together. To give you an example, one player might be disappointed with the removal of the liberation system, while another doesn't miss it at all. Maybe this choice is impossible to assess. Maybe it's subjective. However, what if we look further to see how the removal of liberation affects the rest of the game? Perhaps the devs decided to focus much more on the characters, and by removing the liberation and replacing it with missions, there would be more opportunities for those characters to shine. Or maybe the missions are designed to make the base takeovers more diverse and different from the main campaign. While such a change might look good or bad in its own right, we need to look further and deeper to determine whether it improves the game as a whole, to show whether the game is worth less, equal, or even more than the sum of its parts. For a critique like this, it's important to put our bias aside and don't give a game credit where it doesn't deserve it. Some might say that developers might have put a lot of time and effort into the game, so they don't deserve hate. But there's a fine line between hate and well-meant criticism. I believe the latter is there to help artists improve their craft, and to make sure that buyers get the art they deserve and pay for. By addressing the flaws and strengths, we create a higher standard for ourselves. And when a game conforms to set standards, you can appreciate it even more. If you love the game, that's great for you. I'm not here to change that. But don't be like some of the people on the Just Cause subreddit, who handwave criticism by saying you didn't play the game, or you are part of some hive mind. By doing so, you try to dismiss the idea that gamers should have standards, and that eventually leads the games to drop in quality. In other words, if you can't take the criticism, it's best if you give this video a dislike right away by pressing Alt F4. For those still here, you can expect me to go one step further beyond being critical and go into the many wasted opportunities in this game, where I will insert some of my own ideas which could improve the series. For instance, I think the game's story is bad. It's absolutely dreadful. Many players probably won't find that noteworthy, as they mostly ignore the plot, but I'd still like to find out where it went wrong and tweak the many wasted opportunities in a way that improved the game as a whole, while still keeping it within the spirit of the developer's original vision. But don't worry, you don't have to listen to hours of fanfiction. Of course, these ideas won't fix Just Cause 4 anymore, and I am just only one voice in the crowd. But I still like to think that people see this and start to stand for the quality of the franchise they love, because they realize it can be so much more. And perhaps someone from Square Enix or Avalanche Studios might just pick up on it. Lastly, hopefully I can make this video entertaining for you, the viewer. If you want to, you can put this video on as background noise, although you will miss out on some visuals to reinforce my points. I will also include timestamps for various chapters for those who are short on time, but you might miss out on some context. This critique is based on the PC version of the game, specifically on Steam. The 3 story DLC are included, but despite some references, I do not consider the microtransaction packs worth covering. I consider them rip-offs to distract you from the main game's flaws. Anyway, that's enough of me rambling on. Let's dive in, shall we? Having a good intro sequence for your game is extremely important to give players the right feeling for the rest of their playtime. They need to know what the plot is about, what the characters' motivations are, and you need to teach them the gameplay mechanics. Just Cause 4 opens right away with a cutscene setting up the premise of the story. We get to have a look at our main villain, writer Nick Giovannetti. Excuse me, I mean Dictator Oscar Espinosa and Black Hand Commander Gabriela Morales. Gabriela gives a briefing where she introduces our hero, Rico Rodriguez. Since I think this introduction is actually quite good, I'm just gonna play it.
Former agency operative Rico Rodriguez. Up to this point, his whereabouts have been unknown since our withdrawal from Medici. Responsible for deposing half a dozen heads of state.
Stop. What's this? Did they seriously put Medici on the map at the wrong location? I think they just dropped it somewhere at random in the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at the map in Just Cause 3, you have those real-life coordinates on the bottom. Pop it into Google Maps and it shows it's over here, south of France, not south of Italy. Now, obviously this is a nitpick. Getting this location wrong doesn't have any impact on the game or on Just Cause 3 in retrospect. And anyone who isn't one of the 5 remaining Just Cause nerds would even notice. Why point it out then? Well, let's just say that the lack of attention to detail can stack up over time, and the next instance might not be so inconsequential. Anyway, back to the briefing. Rico Rodriguez used to work for an organization called The Agency with his handler Tom Sheldon. They fought Black Hand before, first in San Esperito during the first Just Cause, then later in the DLC for Just Cause 3. So far, perfect. New players now know what kind of character they play as, his history, and what his goals might be. The game wastes no time.
You have briefed me on this man before, Commander Morales. We're preparing a test. Can we cut to the chase, por favor?
Intelligence suggests that he is the son of Miguel Rodriguez.
My Miguel Rodriguez? Huh. And?
Oscar clearly knew Rico's father, which will be important later in the story. At this point, we get a bit of an idea what our villains are like. Oscar seems to be mostly bored during this conversation. He wants to move on with a mysterious test that he has planned. It indicates that he doesn't see Rico as a threat and that he's arrogant. It's good enough for now. I'm sure the game will flesh out his character later on. Gabriela's character is harder to judge. She seems serious and clearly has access to good intel, but she's mostly in the scene to provide information to her employer, or rather, the viewer. We then get our first look at our hero, Rico Rodriguez, standing on an overlook in the mountain region, eyeing some big tower. His company takes the form of none other than Mira Morales, a local outlaw. She will be Rico's most important ally in the game. At this point we don't know anything about her, other than her sharing a surname with one of the villains. Just like with Gabriela, the game will probably flesh her out later as well.
So, that's my father's super weapon.
Project Illapa.
He was a kind man, my father. A scientist. Doesn't make sense he would build such a thing.
Rico is talking about his father. An interesting development, seeing how this series has never fully developed the story about his parents. All we know is that they died the day Di Ravello, the dictator of Rico's homeland Medici, took control and burned half the country to the ground. Soon after, Tom Sheldon recruited Rico on a boat. There's more details about the latter event, but we know nothing about Rico's father other than that he's presumably from Mexico. Filling some of these blanks has a lot of potential for developing Rico's character. Or, as the lead writer states it,
the big thing I have is when I approach any character, there was an old Lost episode. The title was "All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues," and it's kind of something I kind of when I approach a character, I think about it. And Rico is a guy who has daddy issues. You know, his father passed away. Didn't necessarily have, they had love, but they weren't the closest people. His mentor kind of constantly betraying him at the agency. So I kind of looked at it and said, here's a guy with daddy issues, and that's why he's a great cowboy, and kind of built from there.
Right. Brilliant writing already. You imagined Rico having daddy issues because he wasn't close to his father, but the only reason he wasn't close to his father is because you wrote him out of Rico's childhood. That's circular reasoning, Nick. You can't just make up a new idea and act like you're picking up on something that's previously established. Nevertheless, there's plenty of room to experiment with this. Until now, Rico has been fairly inconsistent. In the first game, he was mostly a blank slate. He loved women and blowing things up.
I'll take that as a down payment.
In the second game, he was the pissed off and arrogant jerk. And in the third, he was much more joyful and level-headed, but also had a more serious side that surfaced once in a while. Rico felt more real, but it still didn't match his personality of the first two games. Obviously, any attempt to build on this schizophrenic mess of a character is going to be a hard one, but I seriously applaud the developers for at least trying it this late into the franchise. But where do you start? The most logical step would be to build on Rico's character from Just Cause 3, to keep the narrative as consistent as possible. We will see soon enough how that went down. So, Mira and Rico introduced the player to Project Illapa, a super weapon that seems to be built at a nearby tower on the mountain. It causes some sort of extreme weather. For now, details are unclear, but the main plot will resolve around it. Almost everyone still believes the story behind its original creation.
Project Illapa was meant to save lives. Imagine the ability to disperse tornadoes before they fall. To bring rain to drought-stricken areas.
Despite this, Mira knows better. Apparently, Rico's father helped to create it. Fun fact, Miguel even has a character model in the game, which you can access with mods. Look, he was clearly a scientist because he had a lab coat. Actually, let me fix that real quick. There we go. Anyway, Rico is quite surprised by his involvement, something he recites later in the story.
He was a kind man, my father. A scientist. Doesn't make sense he would build such a thing.
My uncle was a good man too.
And they both ended up dead. Lots of questions,
The dialogue between Mira and Rico is fine. Sure, they talk more to the player than to each other to set up the plot as quickly as possible, but it doesn't feel too much in your face and it leaves a lot of open story beats that the game can explore later on. The last part doesn't make much sense though. Rico's insinuation that the death of his father and Mira's uncle are somehow related comes out of nowhere. He has no reason to assume this based on what he knows. These characters died on two different sides of the globe, and as far as Rico knows, his father is killed by Di Ravello. He has no reason to believe there's more to it. The game wants to set up a storyline for the uncle, but could do this much better and much easier. Mira could simply ask Rico to find out details about his death when he confronts Espinosa. Speaking of, Rico is here to talk to Oscar, but they don't know where he is. While it's never explained why they take this approach, their plan is for Mira to hack into a terminal at the best defended base on the island to locate him. As if there wouldn't be an easier way to find the whereabouts of a head of state? He must appear in public sometimes, right? And no, they did not already know he was here. That turned out to be sheer coincidence, as implied by this line.
He's only sitting near the top of the spire. All that, and he's at the top of the...
Strange plan, but why does Rico want to talk to him? It never actually happens, and the characters never discuss it later, so we can only make assumptions. Rico knows that Illapa might be a super weapon. He also knows that his father worked on it a long time ago, although it's not clear how much else he knows. After all, he got his info from Mira, and she clearly doesn't know much about it either. What function did his father have? How long was he involved? Did he know about the project's true purpose? If Rico wants to ask these questions, it's probably much easier to do this in a less hostile way. The strange thing is, in a later mission it's revealed that Oscar is connected to Rico's father's death. The current mission will make a lot more sense if it took place after that revelation. For starters, it would recontextualize the line about the connection between the death of Rico's father and Mira's uncle. Now they both seem to be the victims of Oscar, rather than the victims of two unconnected blokes on different continents. By flipping the order of events, you also create an incentive for Rico to interrogate Oscar for more information about this. The kind of questions that you wouldn't ask in a friendly meeting, hence the base assault. Without this additional knowledge, there's simply not much reason to visit Oscar, besides just helping out with another dictatorship or to destroy a super weapon. Both of which are valid reasons in their own right, but neither showed Rico to be motivated by them or require an audience with Oscar Espinosa. Perhaps Rico wants to know more about what kind of man his father was, now that it's revealed to him that he worked on a super weapon. But simply asking around is probably more effective than assaulting Oscar's main base and demanding answers. Based on Rico's current information, it's quite possible that the guy never even personally knew Miguel. There are a couple of moments in the rest of the game that feel out of order as well, which might indicate that they made some big changes to the story at the last moment, with not enough time to rearrange the script. We'll get to those moments in due time. Nonetheless, this odd string of events serves as a setup for a new character arc. Rico needs to learn to rely on other people than himself. He needs to take a fall, to teach him that he can only take the fight to Oscar with the help of a rebellion. Sounds familiar? Well, that's because this happens to be the plot of every Just Cause game. Rico has always been backed by drug cartels, gangs, or rebel armies to take back nations from evil dictators. Sure, he does most of the action alone. His shtick is to go to a place, grapple and parachute around and blow shit up, to cause chaos. The chaos helps the rebellion and eventually drives the dictator out, so you go after him in the final mission and kill him. This time, Rico is presented no different in that regard. He wants to head over to Project Illapa, do his thing, and get Espinosa to talk. But now, Mira objects.
You can't do this alone. I have people who can help us.
Mira, I've done this kind of thing before.
This is different.
I can handle some bad weather.
It's more than bad weather, Rico. If you would just listen to me.
Mira, a plan is a list of things that go wrong. I like to keep my list short. Just be ready.
It is true that Rico has simple methods, but it's unclear why he desperately wants to do this job solo. In the other games, he never made a problem out of rebels joining in for a fight. In Just Cause 1, you worked with rebel groups to walk into towns to take them over. In Just Cause 2, you worked with 3 different gangs to cause chaos in the country. In Just Cause 3, there was plenty of gameplay where you worked together with allies, and you could decide to let rebels into enemy bases to make your job easier. Not to mention that you aided a large rebellion in the main plot missions and the Mac Land Assault DLC. You could say that this time he wants to do it alone because it's personal, perhaps to avenge his father. But Just Cause 3 was literally about overthrowing the man who killed him, which made Rico's personal motivation in that game already much stronger than it is here. Here's how the writers explain it.
A lot of the things that Nick and I talked about was, can we for once see an evolution and change in Rico during the story, rather than the story now begins and he's completely changed. So while he is sick and tired of being sick and tired, he's still a little bit hard-headed and stubborn and likes to leap first and think later.
Sure.
And what we tried to do is, in this story, is give him consequences to that and then watch him change. And then be a different Rico by the end of the story. So hopefully the evolution takes place over the course of Just Cause.
I understand the sentiment, but you need to build on top of Rico's previously established character, not undo it and repeat it. In reality, the Rico at the end of this supposed arc is much closer to post Just Cause 3 Rico than this new version they introduce us to. The unfortunate side effect of this character backstep is that Just Cause 4 kind of forces Rico to act like a dick. He's incredibly rude towards Mira for no reason, and he acts selfish and irresponsible. If you want the main character to root for, you need to either make his character arc compelling, or make him likable from the start. Just Cause 4 does neither. We also see this more grumpy attitude in the lack of one-liners. In Just Cause 3, Rico would comment on almost everything you destroyed in a humorous fashion. This has been dialed way back. Rico still has the occasional quip,
One less blimp, one less problem.
but he seems to have far less fun liberating Solís than he had with Medici. Something that might reflect on the player as well. Anyway, nothing wrong with a bit of in medias res. You'd expect the game to fill the holes in the plot later on. So the questions with this weird setup are only apparent in retrospect when it turns out the game never bothers answering them. Besides, you have no time to think about it now, because the game urges you to get into action right away. So let's do that. Like I said before, during an introduction, you need to make players become familiar with the gameplay. Since this is a Just Cause game, I believe the gameplay comes down to two core pillars: the traversal system and the existence of a large toolset that the player can use in creative ways, often emphasized by an action set piece. These make Just Cause stand out from most other games, so presumably you'd want to introduce them thoroughly in the game's opening and encourage the player to interact with these systems as much as possible. As we gain control, we find ourselves at an overlook with a couple of chaos objects. You get the chance to test the grappling hook on them for a bit before you move on. For now, the hook only has an auto-retract setting, but it's probably better to keep the mechanics simple and expand on them later. The lack of a wingsuit is another example of this. You unlock it after this mission. When you're done messing around, you can only use the parachute to glide over to the foot of the mountain that Illapa is built upon. Sadly, this is where the game takes a turn. So, Rico wants to talk to Oscar, but he doesn't know where he is. All you know is that you need to find a computer. Presumably, that computer is located in the base. With that information, do you A. take the fastest route to the base, up the mountainside, or B. head to the nearby cave system and enter it? The quest marker tells you it's the latter. For new players, this route might be easier to learn the ropes with the grappling hook, but for experienced players, it feels more convenient to ignore the cave. Story-wise, there's no reason not to do so. In fact, it's faster, especially so if you got the impression that Oscar is located nearby. You could take the opportunity to circle around the building and look for him in the meantime. And that's where we get to the problem. Despite the fact that both options get you to the same location, going even a little bit off track gives you an aggressive 10-second countdown to return to the quest marker, or you will fail and be respawned. In a sense, this is Rico telling the player that he wants to do this mission differently than you. If this path had plot relevance, this would make sense. But it doesn't. All you do now is teach the player that you need to exactly follow quest markers, even if those don't make the most sense for the narrative. It's these little things that kill the immersion. In a perfect world, you want Rico and the player to want the same thing. They don't need to feel the same about everything, but you need to understand Rico's goals and how he's going to accomplish those. In other words, the plot of the game should explain why you are doing something, and it should encourage you to solve your problems in a way that fits Rico's character. In this case, you don't only take a strange route, but you need to look for a console that you, the player, don't know where to find. This computer gives Mira access, even though you have no idea how that works, and all for the purpose of seeking out a guy that you could have found in a much easier way, for reasons that are never explained. In other words, I don't have a fucking clue what's going on, but Rico apparently does. And since the quest markers are based on Rico's mysterious goals, you have no other choice than just blindly follow them until the next cutscene gives you clarity. Either that, or you take some initiative, until you get punished by the out of bounds timer. There are much worse examples in the game that we'll get to in time, but as a tutorial this is awful because it teaches you the wrong lessons for the rest of your playthrough. In the case of Just Cause, you should be taught here to use the traversal system to your advantage, not be punished for being good at it. Many missions in the game do this, but there are exceptions, and the game immediately becomes better for it. There's a mission later on where you need to evacuate from the airport and get Mira to a safe house in a nearby city. You need to find a two-seater vehicle, and the game puts loads of decent cars around you, suggesting you take one of them. If you do, you will be chased by Black Hand cars along the way. Alternatively, you have the freedom to just jump in a helicopter, which the game also counts as a two-seater. If you're feeling daring, you could even use a plane. Because it's clear that the Black Hand is showing up with ground vehicles, this creative thought allows you to fly Mira all the way to the city without any resistance, because the enemies have nobody in the air to attack you with. The player has a smart and creative idea, the game allows them to act on it, and thus you are rewarded with the logical outcome. A much easier ride. If there were more moments like these, where your instincts turned out right, it would help the player to become more immersed with the game. However, despite a couple of instances where this is the case, Just Cause 4 mostly fails to do this. An example for that would be the mission where you escort an ally called Cesar, bringing some parts to a car factory. You won't just fly there straight away. He has a chopper after all. Last time I checked, those can fly higher than Tom Sheldon's ego. Instead, the game insists on you hitting all the checkpoints on the road below and taking care of all obstacles on the way. When missions like these clash with the player's intuition, they teach them the wrong lessons. The next time around, most players won't think for themselves, but just blindly follow the quest markers, automatically assuming that doing otherwise is not allowed anyway. And even when the game does allow them to take initiative, the plot often being so poorly explained makes it hard to predict what to do next. In both cases, the player starts to care less and less about the narrative with every next mission. Back to the present. After finding your way up to the base, you find our console, heavily protected by Black Hand soldiers. As expected, they aren't very welcoming.
Okay, Mira, I found the console.
Patch me in, and I'll locate Espinosa for you.
You're in, Mira.
Listo. Stay close to that console, or I'll lose my connection.
A lot of this game's plot relies on the fact that Mira is pretty much the world's best hacker. But let's park that thought for now. After all, I'm sure the game will do a great job explaining how she got so good at it. What's more important right now is that Mira is checking the console to find Espinosa, but Rico has to stay close to it for the signal to stay intact. Say hello to the worst, and unfortunately the most frequent gameplay mechanic in the game: hacking.
One of VC's best guys has snuck onto the base and is waiting for you to make contact. Think you'll like the guy, Rico? He's kind of a thrill seeker.
In this case the area is a bit larger, but usually you need to stay in a 20 by 20 meter-ish area for 3 whole minutes for the hack to be completed. While these kinds of hacks usually take a lot shorter, there are a couple others that take this long as well. Meanwhile, you can barely move around as you are a sitting duck for the ever respawning Black Hand soldiers. Staying alive is actually quite tricky, especially for new players, and when you die, or even step out of the area for more than a few seconds, you need to do the whole 3 minutes all over again. I think it's quite troublesome when the most frequent gameplay mechanic discourages you from using one of those 2 pillars of the series that I mentioned, the traversal system. However, the problems go further than that. Just Cause 4 has a new ammo system. Instead of having 3 weapons and grenades to fight with, you now only have 2 weapons and no grenades. The guns do have an alternate fire function, but each fire type comes with very limited ammo. When your gun is empty, Rico throws it away, and since there's a lot of ammo variety, with a low chance of dropped ammo being the relevant kind, this happens a lot. The result can be something like what happened to me on my first playthrough, where I was doing a good job killing the enemies before they could even get to the hacking zone, but then I ran out of ammo. So I used the guns from the nearby weapon crate, and ran out of ammo too. Since the hack wasn't quite completed, I had to run around like a headless chicken, waiting for enemies to walk into the area, so I could melee them, and finally get a new gun. Alternatively, you have to resort to a less suitable weapon from the weapon crate than you'd like. It's such a strange combination of mechanics for a Just Cause game. You have a series with incredible movement mechanics, and instead you restrict players to stay in a tiny area for multiple minutes. You have so many ways to take out your enemies, but you design your mission in a way where the player might have to use melee as a last resort to stay alive. Sometimes a mechanic can work in its own context, but not if paired together with other mechanics. A hacking minigame might work fine, and a certain ammo system might work as well, but they need to complement each other when combined. You need the time to think these things through, and build your game from a collection of systems that reinforce one another. In other words, this game was rushed out, and clearly there was no time to implement less health-esque mechanics. It's apparent in the combat, the hacking, but also in what comes next. Cutscenes that replace important gameplay. After 3 boring minutes of hacking, Mira locates Oscar on top of the tower. Whoa, how convenient he's at the exact same spot as us. But before you can make it there, the next big cutscene starts. Oscar is surprised Rico made it this far, and orders to activate the defense cannons and to Project Illapa test, which turns out to be a snowstorm. They also discuss Mira, who is clearly helping Rico. Oscar orders Gabriela to
deal with that, please.
With pleasure.
She says, looking just as bored as during any other part of this game. She and Mira clearly have a history. I'm sure their story will be very interesting and explained thoroughly. Next up, the weather core at the tower starts to power up and causes a large snowstorm. Before Rico can do anything, we see that he gets blown away straight into the title screen. One moment the player is kicking ass and taking names. In the next moment we can play as Rico again. He is all alone in the rainforest with a broken grappling hook. It's quite a large change of events, given how the whole plot resolves around this. Rico is cocky and wants to do it all alone. He fails to do so, and then he learns to trust allies to take off the island with their help. Aside from the fact that Rico would not have rejected help in the first place, and ignored the moments where he had the chance to grab onto the weather core to take it out Mendoza style, this whole ordeal still doesn't feel right. But why? Well, once again it comes down to immersion. When playing as Rico, you've never really struggled much. Not in the prior games, not in this game. He mows down crowds of enemies without effort. He has survived plane crashes, missile rides and insane car stunts. The only thing that could beat him were trees and lampposts. So if you introduce something that he can't take on, you better make sure that the player feels the threat of that force. In this case you already have the wind and lightning physics in the game, so why not boot up the snowstorm during the hacking scene and introduce the wind mechanics there? Slowly increase the wind force over time, perhaps make Rico tank an artillery shot or lightning strike in between, and delay the cutscene until the moment where the weather is dialed up to 11 and the player starts losing control. You could even do a Far Cry and add a cheeky secret ending for those experienced players who managed to reach Oscar despite the powerful storm. Without these suggestions, you switch from a moment where Rico is kicking ass to a scene where he is laying defeated in the dirt. Without any gameplay transition to earn that defeat, you leave the player with the idea that the game has cheated on them. In fact, it feels like you could just return to Illapa straight away and blow the base to pieces as long as the cutscene doesn't hold you back again. After all, Rico now knows what to expect, so he can be better prepared. It also seems pure coincidence that the Stormcore test was happening at this exact time, so during any other moment, Rico can probably take the base with relative ease. But even if you do try to go back, you simply get one-shot by lightning or an artillery strike. Often you see games handle their main characters in one of two ways. The first option is to give the player the ability to create their own stories and make decisions to shape the plot, usually preceded by the creation of their own character. The other option is to inhabit a fully established character and follow their story. Just Cause games clearly go for the second pick, where you, the player, don't make decisions for that character, in which case it's critical that the player understands his struggles and desires. If the game fails to achieve this, you experience something that in gaming is often referred to as ludonarrative dissonance, a narrative that clashes with the player's gameplay experience. Right now, you want to make sure that the player feels just as defeated as Rico does. He has failed, he hit a low point, he's injured and needs to recover, and he needs to find allies. But due to all of this happening in a cutscene that's way different than the preceding gameplay, the player does not feel the same way. Not only is the game resorting to these kind of cutscenes immersion breaking, but they also make you miss out on playing what could have been a really cool action scene. This is especially frustrating because later on the game shows that it's fully capable of rendering these scenes. You drive a boat through a lightning storm, you chase down a tornado with fully realistic physics. There's absolutely room for spectacle in the game, which makes it such a shame that a lot of it is cut out, especially during such important narrative moments. The issues with cutscenes go even further. Many plot threads that are front and center have no relevance in the gameplay at all. Why do you care about a dictator who is only seen in 3 cutscenes and never shows up during any of the gameplay? Why do you feel the threat of Gabriela Morales hunting you down when nothing she does has any effect on the player's action or on the overarching plot? They are supposed to drive the story, but they are just kind of there in the background. Most players probably forget about them for 80% of the game, because they are not in 80% of the game. Not in person and definitely not in presence. And why would you concern yourself with your own army when you only hear about their victories in cutscenes but never actually see them advance while playing the game? Strangely enough, these cutscenes are not the cause of the game's narrative problems, but rather a half-assed solution. They seem to be the duct tape and glue trying to hold a rushed game together. There is a main cause for all of these narrative issues that we'll tackle in detail later. For now, let's just say that it seems like the developer didn't have enough time to create enough missions to tell the story they planned out and filled those gaps with quick expositional cutscenes. Of course, this is pure speculation, but there probably wasn't enough time to program scenes like powering up Project Illapa, fighting Gabriela, or Rico diving into a tornado. Not enough time to make the world feel alive to events in the world, or to add moments where Rico is leading his army into battle. And not enough time to make Rico evolve as a character. Which is unfortunate, because setting up character development for our protagonist can lead directly into gameplay mechanics that would make it more interesting to play as him. You see, after Rico crashes, we find ourselves all alone in a rainforest. Rico finds that his grappling hook is broken, and his body is bruised, possibly broken as well. It looks like the game is going for a subplot here, perhaps to reset some of Rico's abilities. Maybe he can get his grappling hook working step by step, in a way where the player can learn its abilities along the way. Surprisingly, this plot goes nowhere. In a few minutes from now, Rico will tighten some screws and it will be as good as new. Even better, in fact. You now have 10 simultaneous tethers instead of 6. Just Cause 4 immediately gives you pretty much all the upgrades that you earned throughout Just Cause 3 for your movement gear and tethers, with the exception of some very peculiar ones. For example, in Just Cause 3 you could upgrade your impact resistance for crashing into things. In 4, when you wingsuit into a tree or a lamppost with speed, you just die. The strong grapple kick ability also didn't carry over, it's now quite weak. When ragdolling in the air, you can no longer open your wingsuit to prevent hitting the ground. A couple other abilities did transfer over between games, but changed drastically, such as nitros on vehicles and the brake function on the wingsuit. It's an interesting approach to keep Rico's upgrades, but not necessarily a bad one. You need to keep in mind that Rico is a lot more powerful than at the start of the previous game, so you need to balance your game with that in mind. When you look at Rico, the most noticeable thing about him is his agility. Several of these upgrades enhance that, such as using the shift key to propel Rico towards his anchor points, even while using the parachute or wingsuit. He can also shoot his guns while grappling towards something, and he can switch from the wingsuit straight to reining in. In practice, this means that as long as you understand the controls well, you can quickly nip into a location, shoot a couple of targets, and move out of there before the enemies can do anything about it. And where in Just Cause 3 the grappling hook wasn't really a viable weapon in quick combat at the start of the game, it is now, due to it being at full strength right away. All of these abilities make Rico a skillful opponent for the Black Hand, and the game has to balance this level of power creep with the right difficulty for experienced players, but also for those who are new to the franchise. To do that, it's important that they understand how to use those abilities, or even more basic, be aware of them in the first place. Once again, the tutorial missions are perfect for that, but the game only bothers with some mechanics. It tells you to press space to open the parachute in the first mission and to press E to open the wingsuit in the second one. And that's pretty much it. You might figure out a couple of things for yourself by accident. Imagine that you're aiming your gun while parachuting. You press shift to aim down sights, but accidentally press the right mouse button instead of your left, pulling you towards the ground with your hook. Huh, that would have been useful to know earlier. Other things are less intuitive. Players might not even know about them at the end of the game. What comes to mind is wingsuiting, then grappling onto something and pressing E to rail in straight away. It's very useful, but not something you figure out by accident. These examples are not necessarily game-breaking. Players can explore a lot of functions on their own. There's even a certain charm to a slow but steady learning curve. But on the other hand, it requires little effort for the game to tell you about its basic functions. This leads back to the battered Rico after his fall, which happens to be the perfect setup for an upgrade system. Let's imagine that Rico's grappling hook didn't just require a screwdriver. Instead, it's properly broken. Rico tries his best on it, but he can only repair the basic functions, slowly railing in without any special abilities, with limited range and a single tether. In other words, there's nothing it can do that the game didn't already show you thus far. Then, a little bit further into the game where the player gets used to the movement, you can encounter a type of mission, the first one being part of the main story. He finds a mechanic who can further repair his hook, and the game gives a pop-up. Hold shift to rail in faster while using the parachute or the wingsuit. From then on, you can do missions for that mechanic, which introduces more and more exciting gameplay mechanics as you progress. More ways to move around easier and faster. More tethers to wreak havoc with. Some new abilities, like being able to anchor yourself to the ground, a function they advertised but didn't add into the game. Or gives a Spider-Man ability, where you can switch from a static tether to one you can swing from. But why stop there? After all, Rico was yoked several kilometers to the air and crashed hard into the ground in the rainforest. If it broke his grappler, it might have also broken some bones, or at least gave him some internal injuries. You could lower his health and add some upgrades to it. You could have the ability to increase his running speed. You could reintroduce the upgrade for crash damage resistance, or reduce stun times from snipers and explosives. Basing your game like this has a couple of advantages. First of all, Rico's actions at Project Illapa have real consequences. If it looks like he almost lost his life, he will not try again straight away. He needs to overthink his actions and find a better way to get to Espinosa. Both the player and Rico start the game in a weaker stage. And where Rico becomes weaker for narrative reasons, the player trains to get better at the game. Both have the same end goal, so the story makes a lot more sense. Secondly, there's a well-paced way to tutorialize gameplay mechanics without it feeding on the nose. This also ties into a difficulty curve, with the easier missions being at the start of the game and the hardest at the end. And thirdly, the player has something to look forward to while playing the game. There's always some kind of cool ability on the horizon to keep them going during the less exciting parts. It keeps you engaged. It's possible to speculate on the reason why such an upgrade system did not make it into the game. The second act, which makes up the majority of the game, is split into 3 different story branches. Each one of them can be done in any order, although as we see later on, the game makes it hard to do them in any other order than rainforest, then grasslands, then desert. The same order correlates with the game's difficulty, with the desert biome spawning significantly more powerful enemies than the rainforest. If the story was linear, meaning that these 3 biomes have to be completed in that order, it would make a lot more sense to allow players to upgrade their character to make it scale with the game's difficulty. It's entirely possible that an upgrade system was originally planned, accompanied by a bigger difficulty spike, but due to the story being restructured, the devs decided to remove it. Rico's fall damage might be a leftover plot that they couldn't or didn't want to redraft before release. The game does have upgrades for your grappling hook, but they are highly specialized. Basically, they give you more tools to mess around with in your spare time. And while you can totally have fun with them, Rico isn't stronger or better at the end of the game than right after he had the biggest failure of his life, his attempt to take Project Illapa. While the lack of an upgrade system is not the only problem of its kind, it is the one that makes you feel as if you're never moving forward. Once you start to notice the lack of progression, you lose focus during important missions and get less immersed in the game. In the end, you have fewer reasons to continue playing it, or to pick the game back up after taking a break from it. Before the hook gets fixed though, we get to experience a tiny part of the game without it. Mira gives Rico a call. She's at a place called El Abismo. She sends the coordinates and luckily it turns out it's only about 300 meters away. That's a very convenient location to crash at. I get that they want to keep the plot rolling, but I think it would have been a cool touch if you crashed a few kilometers away. Mira could pick you up by car, and you could get a lay of the land while taking in the pretty landscape views. It's also the perfect opportunity to flesh out the character a bit more with a conversation on the road. When you walk on the edge of the canyon, you get your first look at El Abismo, the main hideout for the rebel faction. A large archbridge towering over the canyon, home to the poor and outlaws of Solís who took shelter in the ramshackle housing built into the structure. It's designed beautifully, with multiple layers of sheds stacked on top of each other and an improvised main street in the middle. There's also some homely touches, like drawings on the walls, improvised gardens, hanging lights, and even a small windmill on the top for some limited electricity. It's obvious that a lot of effort went into designing this place. When you visit a location like this, the carefully handcrafted touches makes you feel as if it could be a real location, not some building assets meshed together on a computer to vaguely resemble the shape of a village. It even makes sense that the poor would settle in a place like this. There's historic precedence for people avoiding land taxes by building their residences somewhere which isn't officially considered land. It's not too far-fetched that settlements on a corrupt island like Solís would develop in a similar way, or at least temporarily until the military decides that it can be bothered to clean house. There's limits to the care put into this place though. It's a little odd how the NPCs are the same you see anywhere else, often busy looking at their expensive cell phones and mumbling the same conversations. But still, it's a big step up from most other places in the game, and it will be my benchmark for locations in the future, because it shows that the developers can create something good when they commit to it. While making our way to the other side of the bridge, we get introduced to the new automatic mantling mechanics. That is if you don't have the jumping ability of a beast's will, like me.
Shit.
What happened? Everything okay?
Yeah, fine.
It's a neat little quality of life improvement, even though it can sometimes create some awkward situations. Getting on the platform of a guard tower, instead of on the top, can be a real struggle, but more often than not it makes movement considerably smoother. When you fight Mira, the story continues in the form of cutscenes. Rico fixes his grappling hook in a couple of seconds with just a screwdriver, being the mechanical genius that he is. And he gets a moment with Mira to admit that he was wrong about doing Illapa solo. What follows is an incredibly important plot event, which is, of course, played out in its entirety during a 5-minute long cutscene. A Black Hand helicopter flies in and lands on the bridge, leading to a confrontation with the people living there. Gabriela Morales has arrived.
I'm Commander Morales. I have tolerated El Abismo for years. To maintain order and justice in Solís, I've allowed this place to serve as a refuge for the criminal and the disenfranchised. But last night, a terrorist attack was launched against the Project Illapa facility.
They should give up whoever was responsible for the assault on Illapa, or else. The culprits are hidden behind a corner, where Mira reveals that Gabriela is the one who killed her uncle. Gabriela then picks a man from the crowd for questioning, called Luis. Before the situation could escalate, Mira jumps out and reveals herself. Here we get some not so subtle exposition.
Gabriela! Let him go, cousin.
At least you aren't a coward.
Your father would be disgusted with the monster you've become.
You two traitors can discuss your disappointment together, in prison.
Yeah, I doubt Gabriela forgot that they were cousins. This is purely to tell the audience. None of this dialogue is subtle, but this serves as a decent setup for the Lanza Morales prison break. It's here that Mira realizes that her uncle was not, like she thought, killed, but instead only imprisoned. Before the Black Hand can take Mira prisoner, Luis pulls his gun and holds the soldiers at gunpoint. The whole settlement and the Black Hand follow his example, and the situation is about to escalate. A soldier also teleports behind Rico, but before he can do anything, Rico retaliates with his grappling hook. It's almost as if this was supposed to be the moment where we transitioned into gameplay. Rather frustratingly, that doesn't happen. We cut away to a shot where the crowd hears the soldier scream of pain, which incites the villagers to start shooting the Black Hand. Rico pulls a helicopter into a building to save Luis's life, which he then follows up with a superhero landing on the bridge. After another cinematic that feels it should lead into gameplay, Rico shoots Gabriela in the chest with his hook. Her guards get taken out quickly, but she manages to detach the wire and flee with the helicopter they arrived in. It's safe to assume here that Rico lets her get away, since the helicopter was well within grappling range. Maybe he didn't want to make any rash decisions after his failure at Illapa. Or perhaps he didn't want to murder Mira's cousin in front of her eyes. Once they're gone, Mira says that they have started a rebellion. Rico's not very enthusiastic, but he's fine with people joining in who want to fight. At this point, it's not like they have much of a choice. The Black Hand will come back in larger numbers, so why not take the fight to them? They need weapons though. Luckily, there's an abandoned weapon factory nearby, so they can look there. Although, if it's abandoned, why would it still have weapons? It would make a lick more sense if it was still operational, just badly guarded for a lack of hostile activity in the region. Nothing that a one-man army called Rico can't handle. We see a couple of things get introduced here. First off, we get a good look at the Black Hand, the main opposing army in this game. For those who have played Just Cause 1 and 3, this name might sound familiar. They were a high-tech private army that was first hired to protect superweapons for Salvador Mendoza, and later to work for the Eden Company and to steal their technology once they vanished. In Just Cause 4 they are back, and this time we are on their home turf of Solís, a small tropical island nation west of South America. Oscar Espinosa, who funds them, has employed the Black Hand as the main police and military force. They obviously have a wide variety of troops and vehicles to handle these different tasks. While Espinosa pays for the organization, he is not their leader. This honor is reserved for Gabriela Morales, who serves as the muscle villain for the game. At least, she's supposed to. Gabriela is the cousin of Mira Morales and, as we learn later, the daughter of Lanza, who we will meet later on. It's unfortunate that we don't get to know anything about her backstory apart from this, especially since she is one of the two main antagonists. We don't know why she became commander at such a young age, why she is such a bad person, or why she turned on her uncle other than just doing her duty. In a baffling turn of events, the game's marketing revealed significantly more information about the character than the entirety of the game itself. Let's listen to the voice actress, Frida Wolf.
So she believes Rico was part of a movement that killed her mother. So it's incredibly personal.
Then this topic was never brought up in the game. Was it the agency who killed her mother? And why would they kill the wife of the guy who is making them their weather weapon? And why would she blame Rico for that? He may have been part of the agency, but as we saw, he didn't even know about Project Illapa's existence. In fact, none of her motivations really make any sense. In another trailer, she says,
"You don't know anything about fear. We grow up with it. That's how life is here. Knowing that everything you love could be ripped away in an instant. But one day, I decided that I would never live in fear again."
Once again, not something that's actually in-game. But it implies that the Black Hand oppresses people. That might be true. We do know that they brainwash people in some bases. But according to her, this is why Rico and she are so alike. Wait, what? Aside from that comparison not adding up at all, why did she want to join an organization that she feared, then take command, and then continue spreading fear? If anything, I'd expect that she wants to change things so little children don't have to go through the same misery as she did. Which, considering her status as the daughter of an important researcher for Project Illapa, can't even be that bad. Shouldn't her family be under some kind of protection? So, Gabriela is quite overdramatic, a hypocrite, and just a terrible person all around, without much of a conscience. At least if you take marketing material into account. Perhaps the devs realized that none of this made any sense, so they just cut it out of the game. Barely anyone else gets a backstory either. I said that Mira's backstory would probably be explained later on. It isn't. She sometimes makes illegal flights to other countries, one of them to Medici to pick up Rico. She lives at El Abismo. She is one of the world's best hackers. Somehow. She has an uncle that she likes and a cousin that she doesn't like. No backstory, no reasons to understand any of her motivations, and barely any insight on what she could feel during the events of the game. It's the same for Oscar Espinosa, the biggest bad guy of the game. We learn later that he continues his father's Illapa program to sell it to the highest bidder, that being the agency, while presenting it to the public as a project that could prevent extreme weather and save lives with it. Why would he do this? Does he need the money? We have no idea. He seems to be doing alright financially, owning most of the country's businesses. If it's power he wants, it's probably better to keep the weapon for himself. What else did he do during his reign? We have no idea. The missions with archaeologist Javi explain some things about the history of the Espinosa dynasty, and while that's interesting to hear about, it does not fit in the blanks to get invested in Oscar's personal backstory. Although the game doesn't explicitly tell you much about those characters, there are two other ways to pick up some pieces. The first one being a radio station called Solís Hoy, which is a talk show. The topics change dynamically during the progression of the game, making it generally a fun show to listen to. it adds a lot to the world building. The two hosts have a fun chemistry, with one of them being quite critical of everything that happens in Solís, and his colleague just going along with the events. He's kind of an Espinosa fanboy.
It's the Tiago and Santiago show.
Welcome back to Tiago and Santiago. ¿Cómo están ustedes? I am Tiago.
Which must mean that I am Santiago.
Yeah, probably. Santiago?
Yes?
As you know, I consider myself quite an enthusiastic reader.
No, I actually did not know that about you. I know you watch a lot of TV that is based on books, but I don't think that's the same thing.
I had the honor of receiving an advanced copy of Oscar Espinosa's autobiography titled I Am the Son of My Father.
Oh, wow, nice. I remember what I learned in school about Señor Espinosa's dad, Leon.
The book really gives you a sense of what inspired Oscar Espinosa to become the great leader and visionary that he is today. The hardships he suffered, the challenges he faced.
I assume he discusses the accident.
Claro. As most of us know, Oscar Espinosa's father, Leon Espinosa, died in a plane crash about, 15, 20 years ago?
20 years ago.
So 20 years ago, his dad dies when Leon's plane gets caught in a freak tornado. And in the same week that he loses his father, Oscar Espinosa has to immediately take over as the head of all the Espinosa companies.
Where he ended up doing pretty well for himself. I mean, since he took over, the economy of Solís has been, not bad.
And the Black Hand have gone from a bunch of local badasses to one of the most badass military forces on the planet.
I think what most people want to hear about is Project Illapa. Is there anything in the book on that?
There's not a whole lot in the book. I don't think Señor Espinosa is going to give up any trade secrets.
Sure, but
it's just amazing that Oscar Espinosa's reaction to his father's death was to throw himself into Project Illapa. I think most people, their parents get killed by a storm and they think, okay, that's it, these things happen. But Oscar says, no, these things don't just happen. And I'm going to do everything in my power to try to stop something like that ever happening to anyone else's father ever again.
But I'd still like to know what's really going on with Project Illapa. I don't know if you've been outside in the past 20 years, Tiago, but Solís weather is still a little volatile.
Well, controlling the weather is a pretty big challenge, I'd imagine.
But it has to be.
There is the fake implication here that Oscar might have killed his own father, which tells us a lot about his ambition. It also gives us a lot of world building about how the average citizen views Project Illapa. There's a couple of other similar snippets to be found throughout the show. For instance, it turns out that Espinosa owns about 60% of the companies on Solís and tries to fabricate a lot of products there rather than importing them. They also occasionally report on what happens in the main missions and other story events from their point of view.
No official sources are confirming it, but it seems like Prospero Astillero is under new management.
Here we go again.
What? I think it's newsworthy that the largest manufacturer of naval craft in all of Solís is now being run by the Army of Chaos.
These people again.
That has to be a blow to the Black Hand. Another interesting piece of information coming out of that area: a gigantic research facility that some people are referring to as Zona 2 was discovered deep in the rainforest. What's even more interesting, and this is really strange, I'm hearing that facility used to be constantly surrounded by a vicious thunderstorm.
That good old-fashioned Solino weather.
That could be it. Or it could be that perhaps Oscar Espinosa is further along with his work with Project Illapa than he has revealed to us.
You are saying that Oscar Espinosa was responsible for the thunderstorms in the rainforest? Santiago, it is a rainforest! There are always storms in a rainforest!
Tiago, your complete lack of curiosity about the world around you has always amazed me.
While the game should not rely on a radio station that you might or might not tune into for critical world-building information, it's a great addition to the game nonetheless. The other way to get backstories is by reading the loading screen tips. These are often hints about the gameplay or information about a location, but sometimes it fills in little gaps in the lore. For instance, it turns out that Mira used to be a pilot for the Black Hand, who got fired for trying to access her uncle's files. Alright, that sounds like a backstory worth telling. Unfortunately, even the game's Dutch Dragonist doesn't deserve this. And even then, this information is not enough to explain why she lives in the slums, why she has magical hacking abilities, or why learning about her uncle was reason enough to fire her in the first place. It tells us nothing about the protocols within the Black Hand for these sorts of violations. These loading screens feel like a lazy last-minute way to cram in some information that they could not put into the game properly. There's plenty more to be found. Did you, for example, know that Gabriela has been the Black Hand commander for 5 years? This means that she was already in charge during the events of Just Cause 3, where the Black Hand supported an evil AI that tried to blow up a country with a giant mining laser. Which is mildly questionable behavior. It also means she's responsible for creating illegal prison camps filled with abducted citizens from all over the world. It places her in a different light, doesn't it? I wonder if the game will do anything to address these character flaws. This game has incredibly short loading times. And don't get me wrong, I think this is great. But perhaps you shouldn't limit basic lore and character sheets to players with very slow computers or consoles. Anyone else barely has time to read those lines, let alone understand them. The same goes for the gameplay tips. Consider the following line that I will read and you must do your best to understand it. Here it comes. Combine the ability to hoverski while tethered to moving objects with the Yellowstone Auto Sniper's ability to redirect an allied drone to easily move around the world. You got that? Yeah, me neither. It took me a couple attempts. The game goes by the assumption that you are already familiar with the mechanics of the DLC Sniper's alternate fire ability. It can spawn a drone which you can guide along with the AR lens, something that's only explained by another loading screen tip or an inconsistently appearing tooltip. Then, the actual tip is that while using the hoverboard, you can attach yourself to the drone with your grappling hook, guide it somewhere, and be dragged along with it. You have about 2 seconds to read that and figure it out. At the very least, I propose a button to drag out loading screens as long as you like to read the tip. But preferably, I'd like a separate page in the menu for the much needed gameplay tips and lore. Anyway, back into the story where we head for the weapons factory on the riverbed downstream. And don't worry, not all of the plot will be this slow. There's just a lot to introduce here. This is the first time you get to use the beloved wingsuit from Just Cause 3. And again, it's a pleasure to use. Where the last version had very small flaps? Flaps. Is that what they call it? Yeah, let's run with it. Where the last version had very small flaps, the wingsuit now looks a lot more realistic. This realism is also noticeable in the much smoother animations. The handling is mostly the same, although it seems to lose speed sooner, and the brake function is now very aggressive. Tapping the button at moderate speed can sometimes close the wingsuit right on the spot, which makes it much harder to make sharp turns. Personally, I always open the parachute instead, because it gives me much more control than the brake. There also seems to be slightly less lift when you aim it upwards after a dive, and you get less speed when you use the grappling hook. Altogether, none of these changes are a big deal, and it mostly comes down to personal preference. Something that is a cool new addition are the wind physics in ravines and sometimes above valleys between mountains. They appear as striped particles in the air that carry you in one direction when you enter the wind stream. When you jump from El Abismo towards the factory and open your wingsuit, you find yourself in one. And although the wind luckily isn't too strong in this area, it's exciting to reach high top speeds and have the feeling that you are losing control. If you need to travel in the opposite direction, you can counteract them by grappling like a maniac or by going around the stream. It adds variety for moving around the map, a welcome addition for an island this large. Wind streams are also enjoyable with the parachute. You can now use this classic tool to go backwards, which gives you great control in wind streams if you want to reposition yourself for a wingsuit stunt. Other than that, it's mostly the same as in the last game, although it has noticeably less lift when you open it from railing in, which makes it a bit harder to hop over an obstacle. Just like the wingsuit, the animations are also a lot smoother now. There is a certain downside to that too, in the form of input lag, but we'll get to that in due time. So, the wind is neat, but it's all kept rather basic. It doesn't switch up the core gameplay. It would be nice to see it more often, not only in canyons and valleys, but also in a weaker variant high up in the air to simulate real wind. Perhaps it could also affect your vehicles. so you have to steer your plane against the wind to fly straight. Of course, it should not blow too hard, just enough to spice it up, but not enough to mess up your stunts or fights. If you do want to go further, you can add in the occasional storm, something that's completely missing from the game aside from the very localized extreme weather types. Solís is always nice and sunny, unlike the islands from the previous games. How about adding a weather forecast system, telling you that in 50 minutes real life time the wind will pick up speed? You could pick that moment to start a mission for a unique experience, or use it for a one-of-a-kind stunt. The wind can also be used alongside the extreme weather in missions, where it can ease you into the serious shit, similar to what I proposed during the hacking of Illapa. Right now, wind streams feel very optional. You can ignore this mechanic for the rest of the game, which is a shame because the wingsuit can get boring at times due to how easy it is to use it. By adding mechanics to make it harder, it will feel more rewarding to pull off a successful flight session, and a learning curve keeps it interesting for much further into the game. We arrive at the factory and get introduced to another new mechanic, the AR lens. This is a replacement for a minimap and other UI elements. It should limit the amount of time you have to get into the menu to check the map. Instead, you can now press a key and it shows an overlay in-game. At launch this didn't work for me until I remapped the key, but this was patched later. The AR lens has a couple of functions. For starters, it shows the name of the vehicle or weapon you look at, which is useful when you need a specific vehicle for a stunt challenge. Secondly, it's a way to switch between nearby objectives in the region. While the intention of this function is great, it often switches to stunts that you can spot in the distance by yourself already. In other cases, it's easier to open the map anyway, so you can plan out your route. The regions are quite large, and you don't want to blindly select a stunt that's on the other side of the region, so selecting them manually is often preferable and saves time. The lens has one more function, which is displaying certain objects during a mission. In this case, it lights up the generators you have to blow up. Since most missions have markers that are shown even without AR lens, you don't use this function all that often. Actually, this goes for most of its functions. It's certainly a great idea, because if you almost eliminate the usage of the main map screen, you keep the pace of the game much higher. However, the execution could have been much better. As a first experiment, it's fine, but it could use a lot of quality of life improvements, like showing the distances to objectives in the UI on the top left, and a couple of additional utilities like showing major locations around you, showing a compass to orientate yourself, and the option for an on-screen minimap. You could tie this to a configuration menu where the player decides what the lens shows. It would also be a great improvement if you can toggle it on and off with a button tap instead of having to hold that button for the whole duration. Right now, moving around and using the lens simultaneously results in some serious finger yoga. With these improvements, you can perfect a good first iteration. Now that we are on the topic of user interface, let's look at it broadly. In general, this game's UI is terrible, but at launch, it was something else. You could not scroll in the settings, but it also didn't show a scroll bar on the side. Conclusion: all settings are already visible on that page. Well, they were not. Many important settings down below could only be accessed by selecting the lowest setting line and pressing the down key, which revealed the options below. Not intuitive at all. A similar problem still exists in the Rebel menu, where you can only cycle through the tabs by pressing Q or E, despite those buttons flashing up when you click on them with your mouse. Since you get a reaction on your clicks, it's easy to assume that there are simply no other tabs beside those you can already see. Oftentimes the UI is just not intuitive, starting from the very first moment you start the game. After the mandatory servers unavailable pop-up that was introduced in Just Cause 3, you can try to reconnect by pressing a square key with a clockwise arrow in it. Somehow this is supposed to be the enter key. Okay, that I can somewhat buy, but to go to offline mode, you need to press a key with a cross in it. If I had to guess, I would click escape. but it somehow means backspace. And they place it below the Enter key. Why on earth would you not place it above it to match every single keyboard layout in existence? In-game, you can open the settings menu with the Escape key. It also makes sense that you can close it by pressing the same button. However, for some sub-menus, Escape no longer works until you back out with Backspace, which is the general key to go back one menu. It's also not the most convenient key to reach with your left hand on a keyboard. If you want to adjust something like audio levels, you can't just use the arrow keys or A or D, or even drag a slider. You have to hold the mouse on the settings line and drag it to the left or right, with no visual indicator that there's a slider there, apart from the number changing once you figured it out. Speaking of audio, why is the background music tied to the sound effect slider and not to the music one? Why does nothing make sense? To open the last opened page on the game menu, you must press 1. A strange decision, but alright. Despite the fact that you can close the settings menu with Escape, this doesn't work here. It's not like it uses Escape for anything else either, and Backspace doesn't work as well. You just have to press 1 again. So, in order to simply go back in various ways in various menus, the game uses 3 different keys: Backspace, Escape, and 1. Make up your mind! The inconsistencies make navigating menus very slow until you get used to it, which takes hours. What's also annoying about the 1 keybind for the menu is that you can grab your weapons with 2 and 3. It feels far from intuitive that you can't use the first number key for a weapon as well. This regular misclick completely breaks the pace of the game. Sometimes I try to correct myself by pressing 2 or 3 afterwards to grab my weapon anyway, as if that solves something. Only in the menu those are used to cycle the pages, so it only increases my pain. Now, you can technically rebind keys, which is already a step forward coming from Just Cause 3. But only when the new key is not used in a single other action, even when it's physically impossible to use that action at the same time as the key you are trying to rebind. Unfortunately, the control scheme is clearly based on a controller, which has limited buttons. To get around that issue, certain interactions now require a combination of keys, and any button that's used in combination cannot be rebound either. And then there's the map screen, now showing a realistic top-down perspective of the island in color. It looks good, with the different terrain colors for each biome and even appropriate background noises when you zoom in on them or a DLC area. Well, it would look good were it not half covered by UI elements. Most notably a mission screen on the left which you can't click on with your mouse. Instead you need to use the W and S keys to move down, and instead of A and D they picked Q and E to select between mission chains. Because consistency is gay. Obviously this sidebar just had to block about a quarter of the map, and you can't hide it without having to cycle all the way to the end. In fact, you can't hide anything on the map either, since they removed the filter options from the last game. It would look a lot cleaner if they were to add a separate mission tab. It's easier to use, and once you're at it, you can use the additional space to provide information about all the missions. After all, there's a lot of grind in the game, so it will take a while before you get to them. Giving a player the ability to re-inform themselves about the mission's premise is one way to halt the loss of investment in the main story. Avalanche Studios' approach to PC users is a mystery to me. All these lackluster UI controls makes you wonder if they even considered that people would play this game on PC. Or that they just didn't playtest it? Well, based on some other evidence from when the game launched, it seems like the latter is true. For starters, at launch the mouse sensitivity slider, which works on a scale from 5 to 100, was calibrated so low that they had to patch it up to 250 to make the game even playable with a mouse. I usually have it around 200, twice as sensitive as the old maximum. Nobody who playtested this build could have missed this. So, did literally no playtest use PC controls? I simply find this baffling. A less obvious example would be the lack of controls for the airship. Controller users could fly them, but they lacked any keyboard controls. It feels like PC controls for both the gameplay and the UI elements were an afterthought and never taken seriously, which is odd. It's not like barely anyone plays these games on a keyboard. Other controls are just straight up weird. Where previously you used to be able to parachute out of your car by holding space, you now do this by tapping it. That action used to make you climb on top of the car, but that now requires a combination of buttons, namely holding E and tapping W, although the tooltip only tells you about the first half. In general, the control tooltips are really inconsistent. They seem to show up completely at random. Sometimes you drive around and the game tells you the buttons for the radio or the horn. At other times, it also shows the keys to open the parachute or to cycle radio stations. The only thing the game is consistent with is that it tells you that you can switch driving cameras by pressing the right arrow. It's a fun new function, although the lack of true first-person view is a bit disappointing. The inconsistency of tooltips teaches the player that they are not worth looking at. More often than not, they don't tell you the information you are looking for. It's a shame because they can be incredibly useful. Take alternate fire, for which they do show up most of the time. Reading them is the only way to see what your gun does without firing it. In some cases, like with the Agency Yellowstone sniper rifle that I showed before, it even shows additional functions that you can't figure out on your own. Middle mouse to spawn a drone and to guide it. But even those tooltips are sometimes not enough to tell you everything about a weapon's functionality. In this case, the drone you spawned is also able to fly to any marker you place. But there's no way to find out about this other than purely by accident, or I guess by watching that one video the devs released back in the day. In the previous game, you could find plenty of information about your weapons and vehicles in the weapon drop menu. Each item showed a little video to give you a feeling of how to use it, and it showed statistics such as damage, fire rate and accuracy for weapons. Vehicles did the same, with speed, agility and combat capabilities. To top it off, the description usually gave you a small amount of lore behind your preferred drop. Since Just Cause 4 has more complex weapons and vehicles than 3, there's an even greater need for such info than before. Instead, they removed everything but the bare necessities from the weapon drop menu. The last problem with the interface is the excessive amount of animations. In the game menu, everywhere you look, a UI element flashes up or changes shape as they appear on screen. Often these animations aren't even able to keep up with your mouse movements, which makes menus slow to navigate. Especially the more complex ones like the weapon drop and grappling hook menus. While an animation plays, it also disables any key input, which makes quickly switching between multiple menus look laggy. The game only registers a click after the subsequent animation finishes playing, which causes problems. A common example is the weapon drop menu. Click on the vehicle to select it, then press R to drop it. I'm a human being with two hands, so I can press R several milliseconds after I click on my preferred drop. But, since the animation from the click on the vehicle didn't finish yet, the action didn't process. So when I clicked R, it auto-selected my previous drop instead, which is not what I needed at that moment. Meanwhile, in-game you get constant pop-ups for feat scores and chaos score progression. Even when you are just casually wingsuiting in the middle of nowhere, you always get pop-ups for new chaos points. There's probably some enemy vehicle that spawned inside a PS1 rock in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, that should reward you points. It's very distracting and not very immersive. The game doesn't offer any options to turn these off either, or any other UI elements for that matter. You get 3 options to hide HUD elements. Hide the control tooltips, hide everything except the grappling hook reticle, or hide everything. In this day and age, this isn't even close to a decent amount of accessibility options. The bloated design is bad enough, but the sounds don't make it any better. While many of the sounds individually sound alright, there's a strange lack of variation between them. In the menus, when you click or even hover over many of the UI elements, you get variations of a metallic sound which don't match the timing of the animations. Hearing the same kind of audio cue all over again gets old really fast. It gets more problematic when you realize a lot of other sounds in the game have a similar pitch. Using your AR lens, grappling, switching loadouts, certain engines for vehicles and propelled rockets, Rico walking on certain surfaces and even gunfire often use the same kind of high-pitched metallic audio. I'm not very qualified to talk about those, but many times they seem low quality, as if they were created by a bad speaker and then re-recorded. The game would benefit greatly from more variation between those sounds, especially when they add more low-pitched or bass-boosted ones. The music is much better. The soundtrack does a good job capturing the atmosphere of the world with the use of local instruments. The travel music could use more variation. It gets a bit repetitive after some time. The combat music does a much better job in that regard, with plenty of tracks that pick up speed to raise your adrenaline levels.
Here we go.
Moreover, the main missions have their own unique tracks. Each of them seems to be of a clearly higher sound quality than the generic effects I mentioned before. While they don't necessarily feel handcrafted for their specific missions, The fact that they don't get overused does help to make set missions stand out from the non-scripted content.
Is this a tape deck?
Yeah. I made a mixtape.
Play it. Okay. It's nice.
The real standout though is the music used in cutscenes. Much is to be said about the writing and graphical quality here, but these are massively improved by a soundtrack that's tuned specifically to what's happening on screen. Take note of the dramatic sound effects that play when something important is said.
I'm not so sure about this.
I'll fly the helicopter to Prisa Auto. Hágale.
You sound sure to me.
Okay, but you've never flown with him.
Let's go build a storm chaser. You don't think music's important?
I thought that building a tornado-proof storm chaser was more important. Yeah, no, I guess music is important too, sure.
Bueno. Let me know when she's actually ready, That gets us into Zona Uno. But what happens when we get there? What's this flaw?
The shielding there is segmented.
Another decision I can only commend is the addition of a radio. Available in all vehicles with multiple themed stations to pick from, it gives you a wide range of licensed songs that feel appropriate for the map setting and the tone of the game. I can't play them here because of copyright, but anyone who plays this game seems to like the radio. That has to mean something. Excuses for the tangent. Back to the factory we go. Your job is simple. Tether explosive barrels to the gates to open the warehouse, blow up the generators inside, and the main building will open. It serves as a quick tutorial for using your grappling hook, and it does it just fine. Next up, you enter the main warehouse where you have to pull down 2 levers with tethers. This is something that shows up in basically every mission, and the levers are always the same. Fun fact, without any practical use, you can also lift them using the bucket of a wheel loader. After a quick interaction with a console, the main power gets restored and the rebels should have access to the weapons. At this point you get to open the map, select the region and create a frontline, after which the mission ends with a cutscene. The Black Hands have set up forces across the river opposing the rebel frontline. Mira convinces Rico they've got mutual goals.
You help these people defeat the Black Hand, and we'll help you get to Oscar Espinosa.
Rico agrees and they create the Army of Chaos. Let's take a look at what happened here, because besides the narrative nonsense, you are missing out on some real cool gameplay again. First of all, what have the Black Hands been doing? While you were getting into the factory, you could hear that choppers and ground troops were already on the way. Now let's take a look at the timeline. Rico tried Illapa at night. We arrived at Abismo in the morning. This takes place at the latest in the early afternoon. The moment the frontline is formed and the mission ends, it's nighttime again. We skip like half a day, in which a big fight must have taken place here. Wouldn't it be great if we had gameplay where you would help the rebels to their new guns, fight the helicopters and slowly push the attackers to the riverbanks to form the frontline ourselves? Speaking of which, Sargento addresses the point that the Army of Chaos doesn't have nearly enough people to take out the Black Hand. But because everyone wanted to fight after Rico inspired them at Abismo, he could do the same to the rest of the citizens of Solís. The way this works is that you can cause chaos in a world. either by blowing up Black Hand vehicles or military infrastructure. Or, in other words, if it's red or black, give it a good whack. By doing this, you gather chaos points, which will eventually lift you to a new chaos level. This rewards you with 2 squads, which you can use to move the front line, and sometimes it gives you a new pilot for the rebel drop. The first chaos levels are easy to get, but they require an increasing number of points. Like Sahentos said, the idea of chaos points is to inspire the common folk to fight for their country. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is that for some baffling reason, you can also obtain chaos points by blowing up the so-called chaos objects in your own bases. Considering how there's no enemies there, it's much easier to progress through the story by sabotaging your own army rather than fighting the enemy. I don't need to explain why this is incredibly stupid and completely messes with the narrative. Besides that, you can also start random street fights to grind chaos points, which seems to be the fastest way to do so. You could also join in at the Frontlines. The first frontline is a given. It does not require any squads. It forms straight away around the weapon factory and El Abismo. It's several kilometers long and the border of continuous fights between the Black Hand and the rebels. Similar to how the game cut away gameplay for the first confrontation on the bridge, you are not there for the actual creation of the front line either. Wouldn't it be interesting to build it ourselves? After all, it is, out of the box, so large that it would need hundreds of people to defend. The citizens of El Abismo don't have those numbers. They could have dedicated a whole section of the story to solving this problem. Let's say that we play as a small, well-armed group of rebels hiding at a secret hideout and performing local guerrilla strikes on important targets in the first region. They have too few people to be able to hold their own, so they rely massively on Rico. After maybe 1 or 2 missions where you hop from base to base to take out Black Hand infrastructure, like radar dishes, antenna towers and vehicles, there could be a cutscene where we see random villagers start standing up to their overlords, fueled by Rico's previous actions. Then they want to meet up with him and volunteer to join the Army of Chaos. For the next mission, you could lead a frontal assault on the stronghold in that region, scaring off the enemy forces and finally forming the first front line across the whole region. The benefit of such an approach is that it solves one large problem in the game. While the Army of Chaos is supposed to be Rico's own army, it doesn't feel like his, or in fact, the players. Significant moments are handled either with a time jump or a cutscene, and when you join a region strike, it's usually just Rico, sometimes accompanied by a single hacker or a helicopter joining in for the final minute. Frontlines don't move on their own. When you want to advance them, it's as simple as pressing a button on the map screen, which causes them to teleport to another location. None of this feels like you are commanding an army at all. You barely interact with the rebels in a significant way, so it feels like all their progress is on their leader, not on the foot soldiers he's supposed to lead. Surprisingly enough, Just Cause 3 already had a decent system for this despite the lack of frontlines in that game. There were 3 major regions. When you reached the penultimate mission for each one, the area was considered weak enough for the rebels to take it over. The result was an all-out war, where Rico's purpose was to reinforce rebel fights wherever they were struggling, all over the region. You could engage with scripted events such as intercepting landing boats, dogfighting jets or getting a warship to safety, but you also got the freedom to seek out random conflicts on your own. I even made a video about the cool shit you can seek out. Check it out. Once you turned the tide, the mission led into a more structured ending. As a result, the rebels officially took the region and you could move on to the next part of the story. It feels great. It gives you a feeling of accomplishment that after all the effort you put in to weaken all those bases and liberate those towns, the rebels have finally grown so strong that they can win without you. You feel like Rico can move on, leaving the rebels to assume control.
The Revello's going to throw his entire might at us. Once we push back the military, I'll enter the power plant. Right on cue. This is so exciting! We're finally on the offensive! Ah!
These missions work because they are the climax to a story where you actually lead your army to victory, through gameplay. That feeling is completely absent in Just Cause 4. Certain regions have to be taken over to unlock missions, but Frontlines are more of a requirement or source of grind rather than a storytelling experience on their own. So, by blowing things up, you earn squads, which you can then exchange for frontline advancements. The bigger the frontline becomes, the more squads you need to pay. Subsequently, if the area you are moving into creates about the same amount of borders you already have, it may even be free. In fact, you may regain some of your squads if you get rid of unnecessary border core. Unfortunately, the game isn't always consistent with this. Take the example on screen, where a huge stretch of frontline is added for the cost of only one squad. Or how about the two regions next to it, that have roughly the same border length, but one requires 4 squads, while the other is a freebie. Frontlines appear on every border between regions, with the most active fighting happening at road crossings or bridges. Separated by a no man's land and roadblocks, Black Hand and Army of Chaos forces battle it out with guns, tanks, stationary guns and the occasional helicopter. Sometimes jets engage in dogfights overhead. While it's disappointing that Frontlines have no connection to missions, you can still have a lot of fun with them. If you need a quick tank or helicopter, you can just nip in, steal one and GTFO. Or you can choose to fight with your army to earn a good amount of chaos points. However, due to what seems to be a lower enemy spawn limit at Frontlines, if chaos grinding is your goal, you are better off to start your own fight elsewhere. That's not to say that frontline fights aren't a great experience in their own right. The forces don't do too much damage to each other, but it's a great experience to fight together with NPCs instead of your usual solo fights. Sometimes a small random event for Sargento pops up too, asking you to take part in the battle and destroy a couple of vehicles. It's nothing special, but with a couple of voice lines to cheer you on and some clear targets to focus on, it might just add enough flavor for you to continue the bigger war. Be aware though, you can't recall any Frontlines. If you are not careful and drive the Black Hand out of the final region, all Frontlines will be gone. And careful you must be, because you have to click and drag with your mouse to navigate the map screen. Since it can't be zoomed out further than about 1/6 of the island, it's not uncommon that during your spastic dragging, the cursor accidentally gets too close to the name of a region, which triggers the frontline to advance. If you do liberate the entire island, this mechanic will just be gone for the rest of your endgame. A reoppression system to reset your progress in a region, like Just Cause 3 did, would be a welcome addition to the game. But alas, useful functions are just not allowed to be ported over. Now, you might think that a frontline protects the rebel-controlled lands behind it from Black Hand, that the regions taken by the Army of Chaos are relatively clear of enemies to fight. Well, it's quite the opposite, as it turns out. Black Hand bikes and truck patrols are everywhere. They seem to have the same presence as in their own regions. First off, you want to get a feeling of progression as a reward for doing all those missions. Seeing all those enemies in friendly territory does not give you that. And secondly, you need safe places for the sandbox elements of the game. After all, if you are creating some weird flying airship out of a pirate ship fairground ride and some balloons weighted down by dead citizens who totally volunteered, it would be nice if the Black Hand didn't bother you while you are liberating the place. If you stay idle for too long, a random enemy just happens to stop next to you, or a random fight breaks out between them and some rebels at a 50-meter distance. It becomes a real nuisance when you do as little as touch a soldier's car and they decide to send the full Solís military after you. Before you know it, your creation is damaged or destroyed. Let's quickly move on with the story, before the road patrols decide to actually use their massive collection of backup tanks against the puny rebel frontline. Let's make the Army of Chaos a force to be reckoned with. Your next task basically exists to tutorialize region strikes. Small missions involving a central base to prepare its region to be taken over with the frontline mechanic. This is the first moment where the game hands you the reins. The world is now open to you. You can do this region strike or any other, traverse the land, meet the side mission characters or just fuck around. Since the game is still trying to explain its mechanics to you, it's important that it lets you know how to get back to the story once you're ready for it. On my first playthrough, I decided to use the new AR lens to get used to it. For some reason, it showed me a region strike about 3 kilometers to the north, in an unexplored area, but this is not the one required for the story. But what did I know? It was the only location that was shown. So I conquered this huge hydroelectric dam, and when I was ready to move to Frontline, the game didn't allow me to. The length of the border between this region and the start one is pretty similar to the one between the start and the strike that the game suspects you to do. But when you click on the map, the game doesn't respond. This is not a standout situation. It's not a temporary limitation. As it turns out, the game is very fiddly about moving a frontline or not. Sometimes the rebels need to border over 2/3 of the new region for it to be conquered. Other times, a minor border suffices. Considering how inconsistent it is, it might very well be a bug. Unfortunately, it ends up with you taking a much larger chunk of the island than necessary to unlock new missions. The game gives you freedom to choose what strikes you do and what regions you take, but doesn't know how to deal with this freedom, so in the end it takes it away by forcing you to do almost all of them anyway. Most of the choice comes from you picking the order. So I was confused, decided to open the map anyway, and went with the other option. Do the intended strike. I've heard of many players who are confused by the game's weird tutorial phase. Quite frankly, you could prevent this by simply locking the progress on other region strikes until the player completes the tutorial missions. It only contains 2 real missions after all. It doesn't take long. The intended strike is fairly simple. It's a mind control facility. You free prisoners from a couple of cells and escort them to the exit into the safe hands of the Army of Chaos. I'll go into the gameplay details later. You take the base and then you move to Frontline. The next mission starts right outside the base and teaches you about pilots. Pilots are part of a new system which replaces the beacons and flares from Just Cause 3. Instead of having to gather those, you can now use pilots to either fast travel or to use them for supply drops. Basically the return of the rebel drop. The pilot then goes on a cooldown, which can be sped up by taking more bases. Although the default timer is already quite fast, especially if you wait for them in the menu. I have no clue why this would be, but for some reason timers decrease much faster if you lurk in the rebel drop menu than during gameplay. By raising your chaos level, you can earn extra pilots up to a total of 7. It's a fine system, a bit more streamlined than the old one, which makes it easier to understand for new players, which is always a win. To test it, you have to fast travel to the nearby city of Kuya, one of the 2 biggest cities on the island. Normally you can only travel to locations you have already discovered, but the game makes an exception here. Just like in the last game, fast traveling is done in the form of an airdrop high above your target. Instead of hanging from a helicopter, you are now dropped from a cargo plane. Doesn't really make a difference, it's still a fantastic idea for a game like this. You get a good overlook over the area, and once you spread your wings, you can go anywhere you look. Besides the explanatory gameplay regions, there's also a simple objective. Get to the top of a skyscraper and pick up Izzy. You then get a prompt to drop in a helicopter to teach you the web drop mechanics. And then you fly Izzy to a nearby listening post where the main plot will unfold. But wait, I hear cry. Who is Izzy? Well, we got this.
Sargento and Izzy did some research. They can help you get this place up and running.
Who's Izzy?
Hola, I'm the hacker.
Hi.
I hope you enjoyed that characterization, because it's literally all we get. Izzy shows up in scenes here and there, and she guides you to some of the region strikes, but she's basically a non-character. She doesn't mumble a single line of plot-relevant dialogue. She just stands or sits there. Izzy may be the hacker for the Army of Chaos, but so is Mira, whose ability seems to be on par with hers, based on what was shown in the story. They probably work together on many hacking-related subjects, but since Mira is relevant to the plot, I'll just ignore Izzy from now on. Just assume that when I talk about Mira, that includes Izzy supporting her. That's basically the tutorial of the game. It's a mixed bag. It does a lot of things right. It gives you easy objectives to show how to tether objects together in a factory. It establishes well enough who Rico is and how he does his job, even though his character has some weird quirks now. It also keeps any kind of grind out of the game, so you can quickly move on and keep interest in the plotline. But this is also where the game drops the ball. It wants to jump into action way too fast, and by doing that it cuts out any significant action scenes or it transforms them into cutscenes. Before the game even starts properly, the player has already experienced a lot of cognitive dissonance and is taught that creativity isn't rewarded. They have no idea who the main characters besides Rico really are and what their history is, and this won't ever be explored later. Rico is feeling top notch after a fall from pretty much space, and there's no room left for any engaging upgrade system. Nothing has any space to breathe. Everything is done extremely efficiently and fast to get the main plot started, but it forgets that tutorials should also be part of the fun. It can offer interesting set pieces or tell a story on its own. In fact, this is where you give players a taste of what they can expect. And as far as first impressions go, this game seems rather boring. Boring isn't exactly what you want from a Just Cause game. At least it's pretty. Well, the opinions on that seem to vary, to say the least. Open up Steam, look at some reviews, and it becomes quite clear that players are not happy with how this game looks graphically. I find it quite tricky to objectively assess these issues, and I don't care even remotely as much about graphics as I do about gameplay or story. But, at the very least, let me address my own observations. The problems are most noticeable with the water. There are two types of water bodies in the game: sea and rivers or lakes. The sea is crystal clear, with some low texture wave animation, and it took them half a year to add some splashes and ripple effects behind boats. Some of the boats, at least. Does it look good? Sometimes. With the right lighting and some distance to hide the inconsistent textures, Just Cause 4's coastline can look generally pretty. However, without the right circumstances, it looks rather mediocre. The water from lakes and rivers is of a different league. To start off with a nice touch, the rivers are more blue and transparent closer to their source in the mountains, and become dirtier when they reach the lowlands. There, it looks like shit, and I mean that literally. While that in itself makes enough sense, given the muddy terrain, what makes it truly ugly is that the top surface is covered by a flat and static low resolution texture that barely moves. You can see the patterns repeat. When it comes to the dirty water, it doesn't reflect anything. It is not transparent at all, and quite frankly, it does not even look like water, apart from the fact that you know it is, because it's shaped like a river. I'm not exaggerating when I say that water from games more than 10 years ago, such as Just Cause 2 or Skyrim, have rivers of similar or even better quality. Being dirty is no excuse for this. Other than the water, the graphics are mostly a mixed bag. Just Cause 3 may be a bit older, but it had consistently decent graphics in terms of colors, textures and lighting, whereas Just Cause 4 graphics are incredibly inconsistent. For instance, let's take a look at textures. Some are very high quality, but other ones, such as the textures for rocks at waterfalls, looks as if they were meant to be run on a Nokia 3310. There is a reason why Luke DC and I call them PlayStation 1 rocks on our critically acclaimed rock tier list. And that's on the highest settings after they patched these textures. They used to be even worse, but for some reason they made a conscious decision only to update them as little as possible. Perhaps these are meant to keep the performance reasonably good. The problem is that these different quality textures are often close together, which makes you notice the bad ones even more. If all graphics are low quality or simplified, you can recognize it as an old game or a specific art style. But if only some textures look horrible and they stick out like a sore thumb, you immediately jump to the conclusion that they rushed this game and could not bother to brush up these issues. The lighting is no different. When there is plenty of light, the scenes look alright and sometimes even pretty. But when you get into the shade, it has the effect that everything starts to look crispy or dull. At other times, the textures have such a strange way of reflecting light that they look like a completely different material. This is especially noticeable in the cutscenes, where there's almost always too much or too little light. The materials in the shade start to look like mud, whereas the materials in the light, often things like character faces or their clothes, but sometimes the whole scene, starts to glow like a Christmas tree. The objects and characters lack contrast, and it makes certain scenes look very flat. To top it off, lots of vehicles seem to have a much lower quality texture during cutscenes than during gameplay. It's hard to say what went wrong here, but I suspect they were experimenting with the lighting system in the game engine and didn't have time to get it right. After all, they used an updated version of the Just Cause 3 engine, and that game had no problems with the cutscenes and general lighting at all. We also see much better looking cutscenes in the promotional material. It is such a shame that they couldn't or didn't want to patch this after the game came out. The lighting looks a bit better during nighttime, although it's hard to say if that's because of the lighting done right, or because you can see less detail in the dark. However, for some strange reason, Avalanche decided to drastically speed up time during nighttime, so you barely get to experience Solís in the dark. In fact, the most convenient way to skip to the end of the stretched out days is to start one of the many cutscenes that take place in the evening. So, are all the graphical elements a mixed bag? Nah. There's certain graphical aspects where the game excels, most notably the dwell distance for terrain and their levels of detail. Where distant mountains got blurry in the last game, here they look crystal clear even from great distance. Another graphical improvement are the many particles in the air, suggesting there's snow, dust, rain or wind blowing around. It makes the world just a bit more interesting to look at, especially when you're airborne yourself. However, I would give the most praise to the looks of the Daredevils and the Lost Demonios DLC, which go out of their way to get the most out of this game's graphics. With the exception of the Demon Domes, which look like they're straight from a PS2 game, these DLC are full of unique models with custom animations, vibrant colors, and countless fire and dust effects that create a unique atmosphere. The lighting engine actually does a good job to make these environments come to life. It really gives you the feeling that you enter a different game or world when you interact with this content. Perhaps the devs learned from their past mistakes and knew how to work around the issues with the engine's graphics. But other than that, I can't do much more than pointing out the obvious. Instead, let's dive into the main premise of the story. The transition between the tutorial and the core story comes in the form of a mission briefing from Mira.
We're pushing forward, but none of that matters unless we can disable Illapa's defenses.
PC and I have been working on that. All of these facilities house prototype weather cores, and each core is connected to Illapa's defense network.
Towers with artillery.
See, if we can plant a virus in those weather cores, we can send a message up the network, causing malfunctions in the tower's machinery.
Everything breaks, boom, no more artillery.
Then we just have the blizzard.
One thing at a time, Mira.
You are supposed to just go along with it, but especially as a new player, the logic behind this plan is rather hard to comprehend. Eventually you can put all the pieces together, but the way the cutscene goes through all the critical information so quickly and serviceable doesn't make this easy. For instance, the story never established what these support towers are for. Does blowing them up disable crucial technology to keep the blizzard operational? We do know they've got artillery, but those are on the ground floor. It's only when you read one specific loading screen tip that you find out that they act as a router between the main tower and the weather cores. It seems a bit excessive to build a 400 meter tall building on top of the artillery instead of a simple antenna tower, if that's all there is to them. You could have made them serve as important data centers, or as a weapon storage facility. At least that would explain why they are just as flammable as Sheldon's hat. Also, when you pay a visit to one of the towers, you find two cannons that fire slowly and don't even kill Rico in one hit. If you take cover, they can't even hit you. Realistically, these don't pose much of a threat to Rico from a distance. He becomes rather hard to aim at when he's zipping around at the main tower. If the game allowed you to, Rico could easily ditch the whole hacking approach and blow up the towers by himself. Never mind when the Army of Chaos is helping out. This would also create a bit of a loophole in the story. After all, if these towers serve as routers, wouldn't blowing them up also disable the weather cores? Instead of going after the cores, doing it the other way around seems far more efficient than Mira's plan. It's another example of where the story is not written tightly enough to justify the plot it wants to tell. But all of this is information based on a loading screen tip and exploration in free roam. The story gives you nothing to work with, and at this point you are likely brand new to the game, so for the sake of this cutscene, act as if I didn't tell you anything about these towers. For something so important that the majority of the plot resolves around their destruction, I'd expect better reasoning than the game just acting like they're important without giving any solid reason why. Instead of making the audience fill in the many gaps, how about simply showing them how all of this works during the cutscene? A little bit of additional exposition goes a long way. Maybe they could explain it this way. The towers are built on the mountaintops to absorb lightning blasts from the sky and transport the electricity towards Illapa to power the blizzard there. By taking out the 3 towers, the blizzard will no longer operate at full capacity, creating a window for the rebels to assault Illapa. This would give the rebels a reason to prioritize the support towers over the main tower. Obviously the towers would need more defense to stop you from destroying them right away, but that's something the plot has to deal with anyway. You could simply make the deadly thunderstorm larger, so it also covers the area surrounding the towers. Maybe I can make all of this clear by talking over some footage of the towers doing what I described. It doesn't take long, but it delivers so much more information. The same goes for the virus part of the plan. While playing the game, it becomes clear that the rebels can just hack into Black Hat bases from a distance. Sometimes they need Rico to press a button or hack a console, but often Izzy or Mira can already access a lot of it, or they know critical information about its internal layout, as if they have a network of spies within the Black Hat, providing them with intel and access codes. The problem here is not that it matters in terms of gameplay. You already know that once you get to the first mission in the biome, they will explain the rest. The problem is that if you have no idea what the fuck is going on, why would you care? Why would you have any investment in the characters? Take Mira, for example. She just created a virus out of thin air which can blow an entire base to smithereens with the push of a button. If you jump to such abilities without explaining a single thing about either the support towers or the virus, you may wonder if she can send it 2 kilometers further and blow up Illapa instead. After all, if the towers are indeed routers between the cores and Illapa, that would mean there's some sort of connection. What's stopping the virus from reaching the central tower? Or does that one not happen to be inexplicably explosive? I am not saying that there can't be a way that there's a specific one-way connection that allows a virus into a specific piece of machinery that would overload and cause a chain of explosions with the result of blowing up an entire tower. But you would need quite a bit of headcanon to justify that, if the game doesn't bother. That imagination could be used to come up with many different plans. Plans that make a lot more sense than this one. This may be a franchise with silly stories, but someone here is trying to tell a story. They want you to get invested, otherwise they wouldn't bother. To succeed, the bare minimum that needs to happen is for the audience to understand the stakes. You need to ground the story in a way that may not be realistic, but it needs to be consistent within itself. It needs to establish the abilities of the protagonists, the antagonists, and any other elements that drive the plot. This is especially true right now, because most of this game revolves around what the characters are discussing here. If there's any cutscene that you shouldn't rush, it is this one. That doesn't mean that there has to be a 10-minute cutscene that exactly describes all of Illapa's flaws in detail. You could already introduce the player to a lot of the world building through dialogue in previous missions. While you are traveling to the first region strike, Mira could explain her background over the intercom. Have her explain that she used to work for the Black Hand at one of the towers. She started to get doubts about what happened to her uncle and decided to collect intel about the base, until she was found out and got fired. Not only is any conversation an opportunity to build some much needed chemistry between her and Rico, but it also explains her backstory and illustrates why she knows a lot of things about Project Illapa. It even displays a small amount of humanity in Gabriela for letting her go free. Or even more basic, simply extract the loading screen tip and tell us about it during the briefing. Show a visual with lines between the cores and the towers, accompanied by a radio symbol. show some footage of the artillery cannons at the tower's bases, absolutely obliterating a rebel recon helicopter. Meanwhile, you can have Mira explain that each core has a powerful transmitter that has a secure one-way connection to the Illapa towers to transmit data to them. It doesn't have to be explained in too much detail, people don't play Just Cause for that. But if you're going for a convoluted plot, at least put up some boundaries and stick to them to keep it interesting. It's the same thing I mentioned during the first mission. If you don't understand the plot, all you can do as a player is to turn off your brain, go along with it and blindly follow quest markers. And that is not a prospect that gets you hooked. Anyway, 3 weather cores to take control of. First, there's the rainforest. The rebels are clueless about this one. However, there's an agency signal on Rico's grappling hook that may lead to something. Then there's the grasslands in the south, where Mira has a contact that knows something about the tornadoes roaming there. And finally, there's the desert biome in the northwest. Remember this line from earlier?
Gabriela! Let him go, cousin.
At least you aren't a coward.
Your father would be disgusted with the monster you've become.
You two traitors can discuss your disappointment together, in prison.
In the hope that he is indeed still alive, she wants to break into the desert prison. If they can get him out, he could help them take down Project Illapa, since he was one of its designers. 3 different paths, making up the majority of the main missions. After you complete them all, you can do the final mission. In fact, this mission is already shown on the map as a grayed out symbol near Illapa. The description is as follows. Espinosa is cornered in his fortress in the mountains. The army of chaos is on his doorstep. Gather the troops and finish the fight. What a fantastic way to spoil the ending. Thank you, game. Yes, you can expect the story to lead up to something like this, but that's exactly the issue. The whole point of a plot twist is when the story takes a turn that you didn't expect. It's quite an effective writing tool to keep the audience on their toes. By spoiling the final mission, you can rule out the chance that the overarching story will do anything surprising. Espinosa won't flee to a remote island or cower on a nuclear submarine. He doesn't get killed by Gabriela, who is done with his shit after which he takes over. The army of chaos doesn't take a crushing defeat, after which Rico has to finish the job alone in a final hero moment. There's no final stand at Abismo. Any big surprise is off the table. But you know what's funny? Spoiling it or not, that final plot twist couldn't have happened anyway. Why, you might ask? I'll tell you why. Finally, after more than 2 hours, we have arrived at the single biggest problem in Just Cause 4. The sole issue that eventually breaks all of this game's structure and sense of progression. Let's talk about linearity. The common form for storytelling is the 3-act structure. The first act serves as an introduction, setting up the characters, the conflict and putting the story in motion. The second act is the bulk of the story. It contains character development, increasing stakes, progress and setbacks for the characters, and often ends at a temporary low point. From here you enter the third act, the finale. All previous setups receive their payoffs. The story gets wrapped out neatly, often with the most intense scenes of the story. Most of the audience's questions will be answered and characters may reflect on their personal growth. Just Cause 4 follows a, in my opinion, worrying trend in open world games, where the first and especially third act get significantly shortened. In this case, the introduction contains the 2 tutorial missions and the mandatory region strike. Other than showing us less than the bare minimum about the characters and the world, the game doesn't tell much of a story here. The same goes for the conclusion, which contains a single mission which is unable to provide payoffs for most of the characters. Something we'll talk about in due time. So, what's the reason behind this approach? Well, the key is in the second act, which games like these split up into multiple branched storylines, often tied to different areas on the map. In the case of Just Cause 4, about 80% of the missions happen here, spread over 3 biomes. The idea is that the player can experience these mission chains in any order they see fit. You can seek out the storyline with the most interesting premise to do first. Another benefit is that each one can focus on a self-contained story and characters. Unfortunately, this is a double-edged sword. This benefit is also the largest downside of such a structure. You see, unless you go full RPG and write different story scenarios depending on your character's progress and choices, none of these story branches do or can interact with each other. The reason can be explained with a simple hypothetical. The player is doing the grasslands missions. At the very end of them, Rico breaks his grappling hook. Afterwards, you hop into the desert storyline. If you want the stories to flow into each other, naturally the desert story should resolve around fixing Rico's hook. But remember, you can do these in any order. In fact, you can do them simultaneously, but that's a whole other can of worms. If you were to switch the order around, you first play a story about Rico fixing his grappling hook. You might wonder, why is it broken? Then you do the grassland missions, and at the very end, Rico breaks his grappling hook again. Only now, you've already played the mission where he repairs it. Then you head for the rainforest missions and suddenly the hook is whole again. It doesn't work. It can only work if each story branch takes character or plot development from previous biomes into account and changes the story continuity dynamically. Like giving you a different mission depending on whether Rico's hook is broken or not. Something that's a massive amount of work for the developers, and very few games decide to go this route. Just Cause 4 and many other open world games take a safer approach by creating a couple smaller, completely self-contained stories during the second act. In this case, each of them contains about 3 main missions and introduces one new character to support Rico and Mira. Sheldon in the rainforest, Cesar in the grasslands, and Lanza in the desert. 3 missions isn't a whole lot of time to develop much of a story, and as a result, each of them turns out to be rather bland and formulaic. You meet up with a contact who gives you the briefing about what's going on in the region. Then you do about 2 missions of preparation and finish it off with a final assault to get the virus into the weather core and destroy a tower. You do it for all 3 branches and unlock the final mission, but that was already spoiled anyway. So you may wonder, why didn't they try to add some surprises into the sub-stories? Like some turn of event that makes a huge impact and keeps the player wanting more. Would that be too hard to write? Well, kinda. Self-contained stories are a good solution if you don't want them to affect each other, but they are still part of an overarching plot. They need to tie into the first and third act as well, because otherwise the story as a whole doesn't make much sense. To fall back on the previous example, if Rico breaks his grappling hook at the end of a mission chain, it's not just the other branches that need to account for that. There's a 1 in 3 chance that you are doing the third act afterwards, and since that mission's premise is already locked in, the story progression does not add up. In other words, Rico's hook is not broken at the start of the final mission, so it can't break at the end of any of the second act story branches. Of course, this hook is just one example, because the same reasoning goes for basically any plot or character development other than the weather course. The reason I picked the grappling hook example is because the game actually introduced this plot point in the first mission, and then dropped it. I would not be surprised if this used to go somewhere, but was dropped in development after deciding on the split story structure. After all, if the hook doesn't work properly at the end of the first act, it must also be broken at the start of any of the 3 biome stories, which means it must break at the end of each one too. You're probably starting to see the issue by now. The second act of the story is practically frozen. Each branch has to connect with the ending of the first and the start of the third act. So let's see what we have to work with. For starters, what is the world state after the first act? The Army of Chaos has covered 2 small regions and no significant locations. They have few people, few weapons and other resources, and are hunted down by the Black Hand. They have fake plans to take out weather cores. Alright, now let's see what is the third act we're building towards. The Army of Chaos now has a giant army ready to storm Illapa, with our main villains cornered in the fortress. Huh, that's quite the power shift, and not one that you could easily infer. You'd have to show it, but none of the story branches can, because they must always return to that original first act world state. Sure, you can take over bases and blow up weather towers, but in the grand scheme of things, there are no interactions between Rico and his enemies that evolve the overarching setting. You don't see the rebels being stronger during one story because you aided their growth in another one. The opposite doesn't happen either. Rico never takes a crushing defeat by Gabriela's forces, only for Rico to rebuild the army in another biome. The rebels never capture important technology in order to weaponize it and use it for the rest of the game. You don't feel like the story progresses in any significant way during the second act. 80% of the main plot just feels still. At least for the weather plot, there is something to work with here. The game establishes that the cores have to be taken care of during the second act, so that's what you do for about 3 missions. It's not surprising in any way, it's methodical, but it can work in the most superficial way. But then, let's take a look at the harm it does to the characters. Do you remember the initial premise of the story? Rico came to Solís to search for information about his father. The strange thing is, he doesn't. He finds information about him during the Rainforest mission, but that was coincidental and on Sheldon's initiative. Then there's the desert, where he briefly talks about his father with Lanza Morales, but that was also initialized by Lanza. While that is certainly strange, you can argue that trying to dismantle a dictatorship takes off most of his time, leaving little room to work on his daddy issues. But on the topic of non-linear story problems, let's see how the game handles Rico's opinion about his father, based on the information he gathers about him. During the Rainforest finale, Rico finds out what happened to his father. He used to work for Project Illapa, but defected, after which he got killed in Medici. Then, during the Grasslands missions, Rico learns that Project Illapa was originally designed to save lives. Add 1 and 1 together and you come to the easy conclusion. Miguel defected the moment Oscar took over because he changed the purpose of the project to a more maleficent one. Then Rico meets up with Lanza Morales in the desert, and he keeps going on and on about whether his father was a good man or not. If this was a linear story, Rico would know what the audience does. He would understand that his father tried to do good. He would also tell Lanza about his father's fate, considering how Miguel was his friend. By not doing that, Rico kind of looks like a jerk. But of course, Rico can't talk about what happened during Rainforest missions. There is, after all, a chance that the player has not yet played to that part of the story. It has to stay spoiler-free. The result is that this whole conversation lacks substance, and sometimes it even harms the intentions of the characters by not sharing plot-critical information. This is not a one-off either. The dialogue and the characters themselves are incredibly shallow. Not just during the second act, but for the whole game. Barely anyone ever asks or tells each other anything to add world building, character backgrounds, or simply wants to know what's happening or how someone feels. Even characters like Mira and Rico suffer this fate, despite appearing in all branches. They have plenty of screen time, but just like the main plot got frozen during the second act, so do their character arcs. They learn to tolerate each other, but it's impossible for them to actually grow close during this part of the game due to reasons already explained. The same goes for personal character arcs. At one point, Mira's friend dies, and it never comes up again. She should be grieving during other stories, but she can't because in some orders the friend might still be alive. It's also a chance for Rico to step up by consoling her. But once again, each character must return to the same status quo. So what's the point if their friendship gets reset 3 missions later? Similar problems appear with the side mission characters, Garland, Sargento and Javi. Since you can do their activities separately from the main campaign, the game just decides not to include them in the story. Well, Sargento is there, but he doesn't do anything. More on him later. It's a shame, because someone like Sargento should probably play a much larger role in the campaign than what's shown, considering how he's the army's troop coordinator. Even when the game dips its toes into the water for some slight hints at his past, it retreats immediately. For instance,
you know, when I was a boy, I wanted to be a conductor. What?
Okay, Rico out.
The exceptions are the side characters who are limited to one storyline: Sheldon, Cesar, and Lanza. They have about 3 missions in which they can be developed, and then they disappear from the game so they can be inconsistent. But even that's not always true. Take Tom Sheldon, Rico's former mentor and colleague. They have a long history together. He's the only side character who shows up in all Just Cause games. He helps Rico during the Rainforest mission. At the end of that plotline, he assures him this.
I'll tell you this, kid. You and me, we're gonna end Oscar Espinosa and take out Project Illapa together.
Great. I would love to see how their relationship develops, because there's a lot to unpack here. And then he just fucks off until the end of the game, which, if you do the Rainforest first, is about half the game's runtime. The result is that it gives off the sense that Sheldon is just bullshitting you again, which completely undermines the redemption arc they're trying to tell. He's not alone in that aspect. For the Grasslands we get Cesar, a former pilot who got fired over UFO sightings. Now he is researching the tornadoes and thinks that lizard people are behind it. He's very charming and very useful to the rebellion, because he can build specialized vehicles like the Storm Chaser. If you love him, great. Have fun not seeing him again for half the game. The same goes for Lanza Morales, who seems to be building a nice friendly relationship with Rico over the events in the desert. As one of Project Illapa's designers, he would be of great help in the other biomes. But I suppose that it's canon now that he can't be asked. Of course, most people do the desert at the end of the second act, but you get the idea. Even though I'll occasionally praise the writing in some scenes, this praise always stays superficial, for the script is, at most, doing the bare minimum for the characters. Unfortunately, the damaged characters are only the tip of the iceberg. A more important reason why these missions feel so stale is due to the bland gameplay. To no one's surprise, it's once again the non-linear story structure that forms the baselines for these flaws. Now bear with me for a moment. I will lay out a hypothetical set of missions to explain why this structure harms the gameplay. Here we go. The Army of Chaos finds out that the Black Hand created a special helicopter. On its top side, there's a coil that absorbs lightning blasts striking the vehicle. The absorbed energy powers an energy shield protecting the entire helicopter, with the exception of a small hole in the top to allow access to forthcoming lightning strikes. The rebels want to obtain it. The shielded vehicle will help them conquer the sandstorms in the desert. Unfortunately, the Black Hand suspects them, so the helicopter is usually kept safe in their base, tethered to a power cable which keeps the shields up at all times. Unplugging it would fry the power circuits and destroy the shield forever, so the rebels need to come up with a plan to steal the helicopter while it's in action. Perhaps that a small and precise explosion in the weak spot of the shield would disable it long enough for Rico to hijack it. Rico proposes to take over a nearby explosives factory. With the help of his grappling hook, he could craft a special tool to launch small explosives into precise areas. Think of the mine launcher, but with more options. A thunderstorm arrives and the Black Hand takes the chopper for a test drive. Rico will fly above it, shoot an explosive tether through the hole that exposes the lightning coil, which disables the shield so Rico can capture the helicopter. These would all be steps within a small mission chain. First, Rico takes over the base to acquire the explosives. Then you get to practice with the new tether in a little tutorial mission, followed up by a cutscene with a mission briefing for the helicopter heist. This opens up a couple optional challenges to upgrade your new tool before continuing with the next mission. Finally, it's time to steal the heli. Success! Now the rebels have a convenient vehicle to defy the sandstorm and wreck the desert weather core. So, what is the point of this example? Well, this story does a couple of things. It adds a unique set piece where you fight a special helicopter utilizing the weather systems. It gives Rico a new tool, one that's not only crucial for this mission, but also practical in combat and fun to use in the sandbox. It adds the possibility to learn how to use it during a mission, and you get the choice to upgrade it if you want to have an easier time for what's next. And finally, you now have an additional way to deal with the sandstorm later on. These missions have a logical chain of events. Each step builds on something you've done before. Only now, our publisher lets us know that they want the player to pick the order of the missions. They must be non-linear. So how do we rewrite them? For starters, the explosives could be acquired at any time, even after the helicopter heist. This means that you should be able to complete it with just your basic gear. In order to do that, the special shield helicopter must be replaced with something far less interesting. For instance, the heli from Just Cause 3 that has a shield with a cooldown. Any weapon can take that down. While the old helicopter needed the thunderstorm for plot reasons, now it will only be a gimmick. The rebels could just steal it at their base, which is easier, so this approach creates a plot hole as well. Subsequently, it makes the new Tether 2 useless, since missions will be cautiously designed with the idea that you didn't unlock such mechanics. If a tool is useless, the missions to obtain and upgrade it are fairly pointless too. So let's just scrap all of those. Saves us a couple weeks of development time. Lastly, you get to the Sandstorm mission. But since you can play it before getting the super heli, you'll just have to settle on another vehicle to get through the storm. The helicopter is nice to have, but not something we actually need. I think the point is clear. Abolishing a linear storyline has severe consequences. You can unlock new mechanics, but there won't be anything to use them on. You have a mission to hijack the helicopter, but now it's generic, with lightning being a gimmick instead of a core mechanic. You obtain a slightly better helicopter, but it doesn't do anything that another vehicle can't do. None of the missions create setups for subsequent missions. You don't feel like you are getting stronger, because missions do not necessitate that strength. Characters are never going through a journey, because character arcs are linear things. There is no room to build up stakes, and missions become bland without any strong payoffs to your hard-earned efforts. Unfortunately, this is the premise that Just Cause 4's story and gameplay structure was built around, and it causes the same kind of issues. When I say that the game didn't account for you having the super helicopter during the desert missions, that was because this is basically one-to-one what happens in the game. Only instead of it being a super heli, it's a vehicle called the Storm Chaser. The Storm Chaser is built by Cesar and Rico during the events of the Grassland missions. It's extremely heavy and well armored, and you use it to drive near a tornado without being lifted into the air. When you do the desert mission afterwards, which the majority of the players do in that order, the characters wonder how they could face the sandstorm to get to the core. You know, some kind of transport that would not be lifted by the strong winds and not be damaged by the sand. Something heavy and armored. A train, yes. Let's use a vehicle that can easily be sabotaged. I'll get to that later. If only there was an easier solution. Now, I do want to give the game some lenience here. It's a complex task to write your story in such a way that all player choices make some impact on other missions. You would be setting up entirely different paths and endings. If you use Storm Chaser here, you would miss out on the mission to steal a train cannon. It's a lot of work to program multiple variants for a mission, and it's clear that the developers were already very short on time. I think it's more acceptable to breach continuity between different branches of the second act than during the rest of the game. The reason why has everything to do with the already spoiled final mission, in this case an assault on Illapa. After all, that mission requires a train, so if you didn't build one here, the whole premise doesn't work. Introducing another option, like the Storm Chaser, might be more trouble than it's worth. That doesn't mean that impactful choices aren't possible at all. In fact, I'd like to take it even further, as you'll hear about in a moment. But first, let's talk about the tools. Just Cause is all about the tools and how creative you are at applying them in missions and free roam. The grapple, weapons, vehicles, you name it. But, as established in my example, a non-linear mission structure can't introduce new tools and use them during the second act. Do you remember way back at the top how the game almost introduced an upgrade system for Rico and then dropped it? And how instead, practically all upgrades for the previous game were given for free. I suspect this is the cop-out solution for this exact issue. If you can't create new gameplay mechanics for 80% of the game, or possibly even more since the third act isn't suitable either, you will have to front-load them all at the beginning. Otherwise, level designers have even less mechanics to work with. A good counterexample would be the game Horizon Forbidden West. No story spoilers for now, but I will warn you when they do come up later. This game has story branches too. It introduces new tools during 2 of them. The difference here is that these tools are not used in other second act missions. Instead, you mostly use them in free roam to access locations for new gear and crafting materials. Due to this, the game has some problems with backtracking, but it's a decent compromise for allowing the game some upgrades during an otherwise completely static part of the game. Meanwhile, Just Cause 4 does the exact opposite. Instead of giving you tools in main missions to use in side content, it uses side content to reward upgrades to the one upgrade system that was kept in the game: the grabberhook mods. Unsurprisingly, these upgrades, which are the equivalent to the grabber explosives in my analogy, do indeed not get featured at all in scripted gameplay like missions or region strikes. This is for the simple reason that you could obtain them after the mission that would require their use. Side content is, after all, optional. In short, with a non-linear story structure, you always get the worst of both ways, whether you have an upgrade system or not. You will feel a lack of growth as a player, for all their meaningful upgrades are obtained right at the start. On the other hand, everything that you do obtain after serves no purpose. So far, we've talked about the issues caused by the split, and the loops that the game has to jump through to keep some continuity and flow. But why split your second act story in the first place, other than jumping on a trend? What do you gain from it? Do you want to give the players who don't have patience or time the option to jump to the most appealing part? I doubt it, because when this target group discovers the amount of grind required to unlock every single mission within a branch, they won't bother to continue playing anyway. For those who do bother, this approach might make the game become less appealing over time. If you get the choice to start with the missions that have the most interesting premise to you, and you do the second choice afterwards, you finish with the least exciting storyline. Your interest in the game will gradually drop over time, and combined with repetitive mechanics and the loss of a sense of awe for this new world, players will drop out before finishing the game. Only it gets even stranger, because the choice isn't even really that much of a choice. There is clearly an intended continuity due to how the map is designed. After all, to start any mission, you need to grow the rebels' starting territory to the area where the next story branch starts, by the means of Frontlines. The Rainforest branch starts in the tutorial area. You already own that, so most players do this storyline first. If you really want to jump into tornado missions, you can, but you have to liberate 2 regions and grind for some squads, although that's easy and quick so early on. But then there's the desert region, which is on the complete far side of the map. To obtain access to that mission, you need to liberate a quarter of the regions of the game, equal to a grind of about 7 hours of casual gameplay. I've done this because I might be a masochist for writing this critique, but your average player will never bother. There's also the issue of clarity. I've seen many people struggle with the frontline mechanics. You can do region strikes at any time at any place, but the game doesn't tell you about this or show these bases on the map unless you are close by. I doubt that many players even consider the possibility of starting an invisible mission on the other side of the map. So while the game technically allows you to do the story branches in any order, the reality is that the game guides you to do them as follows: Rainforest, Grasslands, Desert. Why even bother with the option at all if it creates so much trouble? I wonder if there's any way where the overarching plot could have worked. At the very least, the game should have had longer first and third acts, if only to make Gabriela and Oscar feel like a threat. Some point in the story where they interact with the rebels in a significant way, a moment to get to know them a little better. There could also have been some development on Rico's father in those new linear parts. After all, the story was set up to be about him. It's also questionable whether the desert story should have been a branch at all. If 95% of players do it right before the third act, why not just merge those two together by default? My advice would be, don't do this at all. There's too much to break and too little to gain. I know non-linear storytelling in open world games is trendy, but for the other ones that I've played, such as Assassin's Creed Origins, recent Far Cry's and Horizon, all of them have a story that is wasted on this structure. This is where we return to Horizon Forbidden West. In that game, the second act is actually much shorter, leaving much more room for plot and character development. It is also a game that relies a lot more on side missions with some interesting writing, which is an advantage that Just Cause 4 doesn't have. However, even then, it's still not perfect. This is where we venture into spoiler territory, so close your ears for about 1 minute if you want to stay clear for Horizon spoilers. Starting now. The game sets up a storyline where you are being pursued by a group of villains, the Zeniths. Of course, these villains completely disappear from the second act. They have plenty of screen time later, and the game is backed up by good writing. However, you still lose the sense of dread that the game is trying to provoke by simply not seeing them for a long time. You don't get to know them as much as you should have. You can't really get into their minds, they are just evil rich people. The same is true for the second antagonist, Regala, who is much more intertwined with the second act and thus barely gets any development. You can take all her bases in free roam, and then all of a sudden she is supposed to have grown very powerful in the third act without giving us any scenes to back that up. Even if you only branch out on a small part of a well-written story, you will still encounter many narrative problems along the way. On the other hand, you can have a dynamic storyline where your choices matter, even simple choices like picking a mission order. You need additional cutscenes with multiple variations, and dialogue options that get added on based on your progress. There are games that do this, but it's usually in the form of multiple endings, rather than merging back into a single one. An open-ended split in the third act, rather than one in the second. It would be awesome to have Sheldon help you out anywhere if you already recruited him in another biome. Or use that storm chaser in the desert. Have Mira mourn her friend in a cutscene not related to the grasslands. Allow a friendship to grow between her and Rico. Yes, this is a game design challenge, but it would be a great selling point for the franchise and a unique take on open world game storytelling. The story is not the only aspect where Just Cause 4 gives you a choice. To unlock any mission except the final one, you are required to conquer regions with the Army of Chaos. Generally, it comes down to about 2 or 3 regions per mission. The process is always the same. Perform a region strike, cause chaos to earn squads, move to Frontline. The options come in the choice of territory you liberate. If an airbase sounds fun, do that region strike and hack some turrets. If you like drones, go hack some drone plants. If you're a hydrophile, go hack a dam. If you don't give a damn about hacking, try the harbor region strikes where you can dump cars in the sea. Or, no, wait, that's pretty much the only example where the gameplay is substantially different. So, why do we need to liberate these areas? Are the rebels using the territory to their own benefit? Well, sometimes. If a mission takes place in a region, it must be liberated, both as a starting location or any areas that characters will move through. Apparently the game can't handle a frontline en route, perhaps it messes with AI. Unfortunately, in plenty of cases, the only reason seems to be to extend the gameplay for the sake of extending the gameplay, usually referred to as grinding. When does gameplay count as grind? My definition is that grind is when you do a mostly repetitive task for a long period of time without noticing any immediate progression. This goes on until you reach a certain threshold where you finally get a reward. Grind can manifest in many ways. For instance, in many survival games, you gather materials to craft something, but in those games, grinding serves a purpose. By grinding, you can craft better tools, or automate your equipment, both allowing you to gather resources faster to grind less in the future. Eventually, you will either feel a sense of character progression, or you get an edge over new players in case it's a multiplayer game. It's also a way to lock endgame content behind high prices, which you can only pay for after you improve your gear. The grind in Just Cause 4, however, is mostly pointless. One instance of grind is the Chaos Point system. You earn them by blowing up objects to unlock squads and pilots for additional fast travel and web options. Since pilots already recharge very fast, having more of them isn't even that useful. Squads, on the other hand, are a requirement for continuing the storyline. You need them to move the frontline. In other words, in order to progress, you need to do the same action of blowing things up over and over again without earning a significant reward. It's a grind. Let's take a look at region strikes. When I bring them up, I'm excluding two of them: the prison break in the desert and the airport mission with Mira. These are story missions in all but name, and I will cover them in the corresponding chapters. Most region strikes contain repetitive tasks that come down to hacking terminals or defending a hacker or transmitter for a while. I will get to the gameplay specifics later, but missions like these could be fun if they had more variation. The point where the grind comes in is when you realize that you don't really gain anything from doing those strikes. Sure, you might get a weapon that's somewhat themed after the kind of base you took over, but due to the new ammo system, you will probably rarely use it. About 30% of the region strikes are completely optional. Not necessarily grind, but pointless nonetheless. The other 70% mostly contains areas that are of no significance by themselves. They are simply in between the Army of Chaos territory and the zone where the next mission will take place. Or take this frontline, that I only need to move because this mission region decided it doesn't have enough borders. Strikes are designed on the idea that you can do any of them in whatever order you like. Only, if the frontline system forces you to take the majority of the island anyway, what was the point of the option? Now, imagine an alternative. A world where far more region strikes are actually optional. Only now, they will matter. Remember that dam that I liberated on my own terms? What if taking that initiative gave me a secret option during the final rainforest mission, where you travel in a boat on a river chased by the Black Hand? What if the dam gave the rebels control over the water flow, allowing them to lower the water levels? Now the Black Hand can no longer send their biggest ships, because the river is too shallow. Or perhaps they could fill a dry riverbank, which allows you to take an entirely different route to the target. Your efforts for liberating an optional base is rewarded by getting a significant edge over the enemy in a later mission. In fact, if you teach the player that the game rewards your initiative on a consistent basis, you could take it even further and have them seek out strikes. This is where we get into my ideal version of what a Just Cause game could be, where you use the liberation mechanics to shape the world and Rico's abilities. You can seek out nearby airbases, which allows you to call in rebel airstrikes in the surrounding regions, both during missions and in free roam. Or you liberate the car factory. Now you can order rebels to create roadblocks at tactical crossroads to stop enemy reinforcements. Or, my personal favorite, you can capture an airship factory where you get to build your own airship, which you can upgrade with weapons and gadgets like bombs, boosters or shields, which you can fight in different bases. It serves as a mobile base, and it can even be deployed during certain missions. If it gets destroyed, you will be able to respawn it after some time. You can take military training camps to increase the number of rebels to help you during your missions. And if you want to go even further, add a menu to customize the Army of Chaos spawns and equip them with powerful weapons and vehicles that you captured from factories all over the island. Just Cause 3 had a system for calling support during base liberations. It allowed you to sabotage SAM sites or open gates. So why not take a good idea and expand on that? Have a dedicated key to call in rebel support depending on the amount of presence in the region. Give the players the opportunity to select an enemy or objective with the AR lens, and the rebels will make it their priority target. If you take the nearby radio tower, you can call on your friends from greater distances. And if you don't engage with any of these options, you are left with the ultimate challenge. An almost impossible one-man job where you need to liberate the island without the help of the Army of Chaos. Only the best Just Cause players can do it. Not everyone has the time and commitment to liberate 70% of the map. So just give them the choice to complete the game by doing a minimal amount. They can seek out a couple of very useful bases to give them an edge and leave it at that. And for those who decide to go the extra mile and liberate most, if not all of the map before completing the story, they will be rewarded with unique possibilities to create batshit insane missions that create endless replay value. Of course, there will still be some regions that must be liberated for mission requirements. Unless we completely let go of Just Cause 4's story structure, the rebels simply need those bases to run operations. But if they are already tied to the story, why not involve these region strikes in a narrative, just like the game already does twice? There are plenty of generic strikes already, and God knows the branch storylines need to breathe. A proper story mission to take the base would give the side characters some time to shine, and it would be a breath of fresh air to take a region with a friend instead of a random hacker. It can be something very simple. When you take out the final base before the next mission, Sheldon will aid you on the phone. He will give you a few pointers and a bit of backstory about the base, and he explains the plan for the next mission. A quick way to fix two problems. One being how the game barely explains what is going on with the plot, and the other that characters like Sheldon lack development. If you want to further involve your allies, someone like Sahento could show up with support during the strike, and you would have to help them out. That in turn creates a moment for him to explain some of his backstory and where he learned to fight, so we start caring about him a bit more. But at this point, why not go even further and merge these improved strikes with the frontline system in a similar way as the region wars in Just Cause 3? Imagine this. You take the final base in order to reenact a plan, which Sheldon explains in the beginning. Black Hands show up to defend it, but Sahento's forces arrive moments later to come to the rescue. Mira observes the battlefield and sees the commander getting away with a helicopter. You have to chase them down with whatever air vehicle you unlocked, after which you get a choice. Shoot him down or hijack his unique chopper. Mira then tells you that they are pushing back the enemy to the nearby river. Rico sweeps in to help with his jet, helicopter or whatever you feel like using at that point. You engage in a fight where you push the Black Hands back bit by bit, until you form a final frontline at the riverbed. The mission ends, and the result is a fully formed frontline like you find in the base game. Only now you feel like you and your army accomplish something together, and not off-screen. While I understand that not all of these ideas are feasible, it shows that, if handled differently, all these story and gameplay elements could come together to make something greater than the sum of their parts. It could be something revolutionary for the open world genre, if it was handled with more care, and probably more importantly, time. Region strikes and frontlines could have complemented the story, instead of being a boring side mode that was there to drag out runtime. The game wants to give you so much freedom, but this desire is countered by its own structure, a flaw that can be felt both during the gameplay and story for the rest of the game. Speaking of which, I think it's finally time to get to the meat of the plot. To do that, we need to start with the world it takes place in, and the 4 biomes that define Solís.